Today I'm speaking with Dr. Aaron Adair. Dr. Adair, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
And I've got to ask, where are you?
I am aboard the USS Enterprise NCC 1701D,
Awesome.
and I am that much of a nerd to have memorized the serial number of the starship. It is thematically correct for our topic for a number of reasons, but we can get into that conversation later.
Yeah, well, let me jump to that for a second here. I'll do a plug. Dr. Adair he's written a lot of things, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, but this is the book we're going to get into later. I'm sorry for the gloss for my lights, but it's called The Star of Bethlehem, A Skeptical View by Dr. Aaron Adair with a foreword by Bob Berman. And so that's amazing work. Looking forward to diving into some of the topics there. We're going to focus a little bit more on your life story first, but there are a lot of other videos you've done, a lot of interviews even recently, where you've talked about your research and what you've come up with for the Star of Bethlehem topic. So we'll talk about it a little bit for people that want to go a lot deeper with it. There's a lot of videos that will do that. So I appreciate all your work for that. And just in terms of a bio here before we jump in, Dr. Adair is in Boston. He's a Massachusetts-based physics researcher and educator. I got to ask at that point, you must love the Big Bang Theory, right?
When that show was particularly big, I was in grad school at the time, and there were a few people I could look at and say, "Yeah, you're the Sheldon of the group. Yeah, you're the Leonard." They're working with stereotypes, but they're stereotypes that somewhat strike close to home.
Yeah, I figured that. Yeah, it seems like it is. It's pretty cool though. I love that show. It's fun. And you earned your PhD from the Ohio State University in 2013. Dr. Adair also has degrees in astronomy and math from Michigan State. And he also studied ancient science and religion, which is fascinating. And again, studied physics education, if I can speak, research. And you have done research at CERN and the SETI Institute. Could you real quick tell us how is it working at CERN?
Yeah, basically, while I was at Ohio State, I started working in one of the high energy research groups there. And in particular, there's a few major experiments, or well, they'll call the experiments, but it's related to the various big detectors at CERN. So the one I was part of is called ATLAS. It's the biggest one there, therefore it's the best. Uh, and yeah, in each experiment, they might tune it to certain things or be looking for particular particles or be subject to certain energy ranges. And Atlas, along with one of the other major detectors, CMS, was part of the ultimate discovery of the Higgs boson about, was that officially 9 years ago now? It's been so long. Wow. So I had a small part with that. Spent a couple summers on site, and in particular was able to work on what was the upgrades to the optics of it. Basically, the way it ultimately works is you have particles coming in, smashing at 99.999999999% the speed of light. They are shattering off with huge amounts of energy, and you have to have detectors there that, one, will register correctly what's coming in, and two, not break after 5 minutes. So part of what I did there was literally taking some of those electronics, sticking it right into one of the energy beams just to get it hardened up and toughened up, basically punch it a bunch of times, take it home to heal, and then it becomes hard enough to handle the stresses. So that was part of the work I did at CERN.
That's awesome. Very cool. And with SETI, did you find any aliens yet?
Unfortunately not. That was funny enough. That was when I was an undergrad as a summer intern, and it was also that time that I actually wrote my first article related to the Star of Bethlehem subject. So I had just enough free time to do a little bit of freelance writing.
That's awesome. I don't know did you like the movie Contact with Jodie Foster?
That was basically necessary watching for being an intern at SETI. All the students, such as myself, I don't know if we bought a copy or rented a copy, but we all basically stuck ourselves into one dorm room and watched it just on a little CRT TV. Again, we'd all watched it before, but it's like, nope, we're here. We're watching this again. This is integral to being inspired. Not to mention when you're actually there and you see the character, that you see the person who inspired the character, played by Jodie Foster, Jill Tarter, who basically is not only one of the founding members, but really in many ways still like the heart of the mission at SETI.
That's awesome. I was actually very honored to interview Sasha Sagan a few months ago. That was a real delight, and I'm hoping to interview her mother at some point too. But that in that movie, there's a scene. You know how certain scenes just always pop to you. There's certain scenes in The Matrix that always pop to me, but in the movie Contact, in terms of relating it to the journey outside of from Christianity to leaving, there's a scene where the guy who is blind is listening to the transmission, and he starts to crank up the volume. You know, remember that scene? And everyone starts to notice, like, he's blasting it, like, why? We can hear it's the same thing. It's just, noise. And he keeps cranking it and cranking it. And all of a sudden it's so loud, no one can not look at him and be like, what are you doing? And he's like, there's a lot more here, guys. And that's when he picks up on the other file that's kind of woven in. And that idea was very similar to, like, a good metaphor for what I discovered when I was a Christian. I went to Bible college to be a pastor and a missionary. And I was like, I thought I knew all about what was here. Like, I know what this audio is. I know what Christianity is about. And it was like, as I began to dig deeper into the origins of Christianity and of the Bible, it was like someone was cranking up the volume, and all of a sudden it was like, there's a lot more here. And it was really cool to think back on that picture. So jealous that you got to work at SETI. You have published at least this one book, I know. Is there other books you've published too?
I've contributed to a few other books, a couple of them relating to the Star of Bethlehem subject, one relating to science, medieval Islam, and education. That was part of a collaboration because there was an exhibit that was going around Europe and a bit of America as well, called 1001 Inventions, kind of riffing off 1001 Arabian Nights, but saying, here's all the great, scientific and technological innovation of the Islamic Golden Age. And it is true that there was this big chunk of time when the Islamic world was basically the place to go to if you wanted to learn science, math, philosophy, if you wanted to grow in these areas and expand and explore new things. The problem was that the exhibition was both distorting of the past and also made a lot of claims that just were not even well backed up as well, including claims of like powered flight from the medieval period. Or at least the way they portrayed it, it sounded like power flight, even though at best it was a glider, things like that. And I was working with, proper experts in like Islamic history, but also with my contribution saying, hey, I'm specifically in education research. So I did a combination of, here's the claims at the exhibition, here's how it doesn't historically add up. If we wanted to do a proper exhibition of, say, in particular, the contributions of Islamic scholars to our understanding of the universe, how we have created different models from the simplistic flat earth model that is very wrong to the Ptolemaic system of epicycles, which is wrong, but less wrong, to other fixes that came about during the Islamic period that were still geocentric, but were improvements on what Ptolemy was trying to do in terms of the physics involved. You can also see some of the inspiration later in the works of Copernicus, because he would use some of the same mathematical concepts to get his heliocentric model to work. We don't actually know if Copernicus was actually using these Islamic scholars on that particular point or not. It's still argued. But nonetheless, you can see this sort of, various attempts. And it's like, hey, we could easily do a great exhibition on this and explain why are these different models coming up? What's the different thought process going on there? How do we balance between a fit to observational data to physical considerations? Because like Ptolemy's model was really predictive. It was actually better even than Copernicus's model if you wanted to know where the planets were. But the physics was even absurd in the geocentric world, because he basically had to have the Earth off from the center that like the sun would orbit around. And while it made the astronomy work, on a physics point of view, it's like, wait, here's how this is supposed to work. You just decided, it's off by a couple thousand miles or whatever. It's like, no, we got to find some way to fix this problem. That was one of the things that some Islamic astronomers were trying to do, and slowly help push us along to find, okay, this isn't working, let's try this. We want something that's both fitting the observations and makes sense of our underlying physics. And it's, you don't want to draw a straight line saying, it's this obvious progression to our current model, but the thought process and how that moves us forward is, I think, one, interesting, two, more accurate, and three, shows actual contributions, even if they're quote unquote wrong theories in the end.
That's amazing. The way you were talking reminds me, I like to watch and show my kids the show Cosmos with Neil deGrasse Tyson. And it's a lot of background comes up on, on a really easy level, even that kids can follow, but it's really cool to kind of see some of the history behind how things have progressed and moved to where we are today. Um, Finishing up your bio, I've got one last note. You are a long distance runner, 5Ks and long marathons. How long have you been doing that? And what's your favorite part of doing those?
Well, I started getting into running a little bit after I moved here to Massachusetts. So about 5-ish years ago. It's kind of amazing that it happened because when I first moved here, I was about 20, 30 pounds heavier than I am now. And basically happened in part because I moved into an apartment building with a gym downstairs. So what's the excuse for not exercising? And then my friends were like, hey, we're going to go and do this 5K. Do you want to join us? And I'm like, okay, get a cheap pair of running shoes. And I beat them in the 5K. So it's like, all right, we're going to keep doing this then. And then at 5K turned into a 10, into a half marathon, to a full marathon. And now I've done one official ultra marathon and a couple unofficial ones to pretty absurd distances. And I really do enjoy like going out for runs. I can put a couple podcasts in my ears or just enjoy the run in nature. And right now in New England, it's just absolutely beautiful to run with all the leaves changing colors around here. So just having that chance to just, one, do something good for my health, and two, something amazing for my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. Well, Iron Man, here we come. You think you could tackle that one?
If I could, it would be damn slow, especially because I've always been a weak swimmer. So I think an Ironman includes like a mile swim. So that'd probably take me 2-3 days. I'm exaggerating, but I know I am a slow swimmer. I've only done a mile swim once when I was in Boy Scouts, and I was, slow as hell.
Yeah, I'd be the same. It's amazing though to see some of the skills and how in shape and strong these people are to do that. It's very admirable. Well, I appreciate your giving us some of your background. I'd love to, at this point, again, we're going to get into your book in a little bit, but I'd love to just kind of hear your background, no matter what it is, religious or not. I'd love to hear where you're coming from, what you were taught as a child, and kind of how that evolved over the years.
Yeah. So originally I grew up in Michigan, and if you want more details about that, I can bring up my Michigan map. Yes, everyone in Michigan does this. We know the state like the back of our hand.
Nice.
So I grew up in the Tri-City area, and because Michigan used to be part of New France, it has a long French and Catholic tradition. So most of my family is French and Irish, so mostly Catholic as well. But of course, when I say Catholic, it isn't like Opus Dei level things like that. I tried thinking back to the background I had, and like I did go to Sunday school for the first few years of my education. I went to a private Catholic school, but I also remember being like almost on purpose uninterested in religious studies at those times. The best I remember is they talked about Jesus and like how he was a swell guy and you shouldn't be selfish. And otherwise, remember, like, okay, here are the rituals you need to do. Here are the stations of the cross. Here's the ways how you hold out your hand when you're supposed to take the bread. And here's what you're supposed to say and how you're supposed to move your hands when you're blessing yourself. Beyond that, any of the theology, I have like no memory of learning that. And honestly, I learned more about religion and Catholicism after I left the religion.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So many people would ditto that in some ways, in various things, but just the idea of the Stockholm syndrome, like we want to know who was our captor. Sounds like you weren't in it to the point where you would have called it your captor, but for a lot of us, it's like we do feel like it was a captor. We want to know what, yes, we're out and we're fully out, but what was this thing?
Yeah. I never felt captured by it. For the most part, it felt like, we're going to do like the major Christian celebrations like Easter or Christmas and things like that. We'll go to churches for weddings, but otherwise, the fact that I was Catholic is just basically telling me like, here's the color of the wrapping paper that the present's going to be wrapped in. It did not feel that integral to my, way of living or things like that. For the most part, it's be good for goodness sake. I might think, I should do this because there's supposed to be a religion reason for it, but can I cite chapter and verse? I don't know how many Corinthians there are in the Bible at the time, nothing like that.
When you were like in church and they would do the sermons or I think they call them homilies, did they say stuff like you're in danger of, hell or purgatory if you don't believe a certain thing? Do you remember anything like that?
I frankly, I remember learning more about hellfire from The Simpsons than I remember from any of the homilies. And that's probably a combination of one, me not paying attention because I'm a child. And two, once I was about 13 years old, for whatever reason, our family just started getting lazy and just not going to church regularly at all.
Hmm.
So I probably stopped going to Sunday school, maybe around the age of 10-ish, something like that. I was in public schools and that. So for the most part, that I was Catholic is only basically reminded of when it's a major holiday and if I'm going to see my grandparents and they're going to bless the meal or things like that. Beyond that, it was just not that important, even ritually.
Hmm.
So like by the time I like off and going to college, I would say I was effectively a Catholic deist, that Catholicism is like the background, it's like the coloring, but the way the universe actually is that there is a God that set things in order, but everything runs according to the laws of science, which is great for me because I wanted to be a scientist. I understand the world as working as under natural law. And to me, a perfect God is the one who sets up the universe and doesn't have to tinker with it. Anything less than that shows he's a bad mechanic.
Hmm. That's interesting. Did you know anyone though, like either in your family or friends who you would have called, devout or practicing? And did you ever have them, did anyone, I guess even outside of Catholicism, like even as a evangelical Protestant Christian, did anyone ever kind of invite you to the deeper life with Christ?
I honestly remember my first encounter with someone who was evangelical and a young earth creationist when I was at college working at a planetarium. I was a show presenter at Michigan State. And I remember at the end of one of our shows, and the show was all about cosmology, like here is like the structure of the universe, the origins, how we know about it. And at the end, this gentleman who said he was a pastor said, it was a great show, but I don't believe any of it. And, we chatted for a bit. We actually even prayed together at the end. And that was like my first encounter with an evangelical young earth creationist Protestant. So yeah, I was pretty sheltered from many of that. And like I say, like the hellfire, the fire and brimstone sort of stuff. Honestly, I only saw that like literally in cartoon form. My most vivid images of hell literally are from The Simpsons, where Ned Flanders is the devil. That's like, I know like that was supposed to be part of the tradition, but it wasn't something beaten into me by my parents. Like among my parents, like my mother is more religious. My father almost never talks about it. And when he does, he's basically an agnostic or atheist. When we went to church, usually he would stay home on the couch. So there was never that strong of a push in any direction.
So it sounds like there was a good exposure to secularism, maybe the idea that we can be good and we can be awesome as a family, as a culture, without being devout or on fire for the Lord. That's really good. It's I mean, for whatever good or bad points people would point out about that difference, I think it's so cool because for a lot of us that isn't even remotely an option. Like if you are not in the right church, listening to the right preacher with the right theology and the right doctrinal statement, you're wasting your life. You're basically giving the finger to God and saying, I'm going to do it my way. And everyone that's in those groups knows that those people who are, the Catholics and the Christians that are kind of just living for themselves, they're going to either turn at some point and bow the knee and get right with God, or they're going to deeply regret it when they die. Whether go to hell because you weren't really a believer, or because you do get in because you really did believe, but you just kind of wasted your life. And while everyone else is getting their crowns and their jewels and their rewards, you're going to be kind of sitting there thinking, I'm glad I made it, but it's kind of a shame I didn't give anything, I don't have anything to kind of present to God as a good work. And so it's really fascinating. I have to segue for a second because that guy you mentioned at the planetarium, and we'll go right back to your story, but did they ever, in your chats with people like that, did they ever bring up the subject or the objection of, yes, the stars are X billion light years away, and yes, we're here, but and that distance is real, but the reason that it looks that old to us is because he not only created this star that far away and us here, but he created the light in between to make it look like it was old, but it's actually not that old. It's at whatever stage you need that light to be between there and here, he created that light in like an intermediary form. Did you ever hear that objection?
At least not when I was working at the planetarium. There's also like some level of self-selection because if you're going to a university planetarium, you're probably already a certain kind of person with certain kinds of interests, and you're interested in mainstream science and consensus positions and what universities teach about this sort of thing. Not to mention, also a lot of the shows are for like kids, and a big chunk of the shows as well are going to be like, here in general, here's the night sky. And the entire history of the planetarium, like when it was first literally invented in the 1920s in Germany and then imported to the US, it was because all this artificial lighting has basically destroyed the night sky. If you're a New Yorker, it's sometimes hard to see the moon, let alone the Milky Way. So the planetarium was basically invented as a way for urbane people to actually go and rediscover the night sky and realize, oh, here's how you find north. Here's the various stars. Here are the stories that are attached to the stars. Here's how they move throughout the night. Here's what it'll look like if you're in the South America and how it changes. Here's what it'll look like in 10,000 years or anything else you want to do. It's all those sorts of powers that we have by using the dome that way. Or on the other hand, if you're in Chicago and it's a cloudy day or just a regular day in Chicago, the number of stars you can probably count on one hand.
Yeah.
So
I know what you mean.
Yeah. So it's very rare that like I can only remember one person coming up and objecting to the contents of the show on any sort of religious grounds. And yeah, it was very much outside of that domain. It was mostly on the internet when I discovered people saying, yeah, God is trying to fool us and make us think something is very far away, which, is a pretty weird thing for God to do. Does it also mean God is deceiving me that there's a tiger over there? That he only invented the light halfway between me and what's actually not there to fool me? It's like, that's a pretty scary universe to live in.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing. Just there is this whole list that they come up with of anything they can do to increase, in my opinion, the cognitive dissonance, to just say there's just no way that I could have a universe that old. And it's been interesting to see recently some of the top apologists have come out and in favor of an old universe, old compared to the 6,000-year-old story. And it's fascinating this the divide. But I was in that young Earth camp, and to me, the idea that the Earth was old was just absurd beyond words. And it was one of the first things that dominoes that kind of fell for me when I was deconverting. I had done a 18-month, very in-depth study of the origins of the Bible, specifically the Gospels and the New Testament, the Yahweh character. And until I had that mythology background really structured and in place, I just kept on defending it in my mind. But once I deconverted, like the ramifications hit very quickly. Of course, the big one is, wow, there's probably no afterlife. I'm probably going to just be dead when I'm dead. But then one of the first ones after that was evolution might be true. The Earth might be, really, really old. The universe might be old. And it's once you do that, it's like the scales drop from your eyes. You're like, oh, I can stop fighting all these scientific things. And all these guys that are doing these nature stories, they're not the enemy. They're not from Satan and demonically inspired. They're just scientists sharing their knowledge. And it's so freeing. It's so nice to be able to look at a science show and think, I'm not trying to pull apart and act like I'm smarter than some guy that's got 4 PhDs in astrophysics. It's like, no, they're still admitting, Neil deGrasse Tyson in Cosmos does it. He admits like there's a lot we don't know. We're not trying to make ourselves, some kind of super brilliant people who act like we've got all the answers, but we have some more answers than we used to. And we certainly have more answers than we did in the Bronze Age. And we're going to share that knowledge with you. And it's this humility to say, I can listen for the first time with a truly open mind to the scientists is such a freeing thing. And it's so cool. And it's so frustrating to see. I've got loved ones still very stuck in it. I mean, fundamentalist pro-Trump Christians, and the idea of the science that you would bring up or that Neil deGrasse Tyson would bring up is just, you all are in the depths of deception so bad it's not even funny. And it's so nice to be on the other side of that. When you talk with people like that, like I was before, when you talk with them now, do you feel like it's worth it? Or do you feel like they're so blinded that it's like, we might as well talk, like as Richard Dawkins jokes, might as well, try to decide whether we should debate the Stork theory of reproduction. Like, I'm just not going to do it. Is it worth it to you to debate these things?
I probably wouldn't use the word debate, just because that's the sort of thing that will get people's defenses up. But discussion, I think that is absolutely necessary. Um, how it's approached, I might depend on person to person. Uh, I'm not exactly sure might be the best way to convince someone to change their political views, especially about the previous president. But say in terms of Seventh-day Adventist, I'm getting the two confused right now. Young Earth creationism. I am getting them confused because one of the interesting things that was pointed out very well by the historian of science Ronald Numbers, that the creationists, the young Earth creationists, are actually a relatively modern phenomenon and are basically an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventists. That it basically shows in documents that basically like one of the earliest people to like propose things like flood geology and things like that, trying to show that the Earth is only 6-ish thousand years old, was a Seventh-day Adventist who was basically trying to prove that the prophetess of that group wasn't wrong when she basically said, yeah, Bishop Ussher's chronology is the correct one. So one way of possibly approaching arguing against young Earth creation is saying, you're following a heresy. You're basically, following in the footsteps of this Canadian prophet, Ellen G. White, and her claim. So it's like, I haven't had an opportunity to test that out, but because of that history, you could say, you could try going this approach, but literally when young Earth creation started even coming into existence, it was itself a response to 19th century theology that already most theologians had already dumped the idea that like a day has to be exactly 24 hours or anything like that. Like I said, I haven't had a chance to test that out to see how that might work, but it's just one of the things you could say, well, you're trying to act like this is, the old time religion, but literally this is late 19th, early 20th century machinations of a fringe group that basically became popular ultimately for political reasons. Will that actually work? Can it at least plant a seed of doubt? I hope so. But as well, when it comes to like saying, if someone is going to tell me light was created by God to only have certain appearances, you've now created a deceptive God. What else are you being deceived by? Are you really going to live in that world where God is a liar? And of course, you're going to say, well, you can't say the book is a lie, but it's like saying, if you're telling me my eyes are lying to me, I'm going to have to say, okay, then I can't trust what the book reads as well because I'm using my eyes. If you want to be consistent, you're going to have to find a new way to consistently hold things together. And if you're okay with a God that is filled with fire, brimstone, anger, rage, and deception, are you sure you're not worshiping the devil?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And there is actually, ironically, a verse, at least one, probably more, but there is a verse where it says that God specifically sends a deception so that the people won't believe. And I believe it's also, again, in the New Testament, it has the idea of God gives them, like, if you are a sinner and you are specifically, God invites you to please repent. And so you've kind of been given the light, you've been given the invitation, please turn from your sin, turn toward me. If you don't, you have a cold heart, it says God rewards your coldness with hardness. So he takes your cold heart that won't bow your knee to him, and he makes your cold heart now hard like a stone. So now you can't, like you've kind of said, God, I won't. And he turns around and says, okay, I'm going to make it so you can't even turn to me. And that relates a little bit to Calvinism. But it talks about how, like, at that point, you can't even, like, God could send you the message and you just couldn't acknowledge it. And there's verses woven, I think in Romans, I'm thinking of, where it talks about, like, lest they believe. And Jesus, it seems like he indicates, even in the Gospels, there are certain ways in which he kind of wants certain people to believe, but he doesn't want other people to believe. He's like, don't tell anybody who I am. And it is very deceptive. It's very selective. And it's very strange, because you'd think, if he's supposedly this God of, the evangelical community is like, God is just love, love, love. He loves the world. Everyone, God loves you. But if he really loves you, then when you have a blind man that's healed and he has the chance to say, everyone, Jesus did it, go worship Jesus. And Jesus says, stop talking. Don't tell anybody I did it. You'd be like, why? That seems kind of weird to not want to tell the world about how awesome you are. And the verses in the Old Testament, for sure, about the deception, it doesn't make sense. And it even talks about how God is the God who destroys. And you're like, is God a God of love? Or is he God of hate? Is he a God of life, or is he a God of destruction and death? And Christians are so selective. And that was one of the biggest parts of my deconstruction that was hard to realize, was this God that I'd kind of painted in my mind as wonderful and loving and caring. He's the God who commands genocide. He's the God who commands child brides. He's the God who commands genital mutilation and land theft and beating your slaves. It's like, you, at some point, you have to admit as a Christian, this Yahweh character is not a nice character. And ultimately, in my opinion, they paint the character as both narcissistic, like worship me, only me, and then very psychotic, like love me back. Like I love you and you need to love me back. And if you do, we're fine. But if you don't, I'll kill you. Like that's a psychopath. And it's amazing the way that Christians try to ignore that. And it's just, you can't. I mean, they try to paint it in so many ways. And so, oh, well, it was a different time, got a different reason for doing things. And it's like, no, God was a murderous, genocidal character. But they find their ways. Well,
it always does impress me when they create the ultimate imperator to morals, and yet I'm pretty sure everyone I know is more moral than their vision of God.
Yes, exactly. And they talk about morality being like unchanging. Well, if it was unchanging, then why was genocide okay back then, but it's not now? You know, why is beating your slaves okay back then, but not now? It's like, it was clearly a culturally relevant morality. So why is it somehow set in stone now? Yeah, it frustrates me to even think about. Well, going back to your story, I was curious. You mentioned, that you weren't really exposed to evangelical Christianity. You were exposed to a very light Catholicism, light, if I could put it that way. Was there ever any point at which you did get invited to like an evangelical kind of Billy Graham crusade event, or something where someone said, presented the gospel, even one-on-one, where someone said, hey, I'm burdened for your soul, Aaron. I need you to understand you are actually in danger. Did anyone present the gospel to you? And if so, what was that like?
I do remember actually one or two encounters back at Michigan State, not with evangelicals, but with a couple of Mormon missionaries. And I remember like stopping along the walkway and chatting with them for 10-ish or so minutes or something like that, and letting them discuss their beliefs about that, and how their prophet is so amazing. I remember at least making also one decent joke at that time, because on the Michigan State campus, there's a small river going through called the Red Cedar, the Red Cedar River. And they were talking about how important their prophet was. And it was like, well, if their prophet is so important, then and supposed to be like Moses, then shouldn't he be able to then part the Red Cedar, just like Moses parted the Red Sea? And I thought that joke was clever at the time. And fortunately, they laughed with me. So, good times were had. Obviously, they didn't convince me to join Mormonism, but I do remember an encounter like that. In grad school, I also let a couple of Mormons take me into their main recruitment center, just to also give me both a copy of Book of Mormon and some other material to peruse over, and chatted with them for about maybe an hour, mostly just so that way I could also have them tell me what they think, because it's very easy for me to find what an atheist will say about Mormons. I want to hear how Mormons want to describe themselves and how they present themselves. But never remember going to a crusade. I did have, religious classmates. I do remember in particular in one of the philosophy classes I was part of at Michigan State, one of the classmates, really nice guy, was also part of Campus Crusade for Christ. And I also remember seeing him on the last day I can remember actually being religious. And it was actually at an atheist Christian debate right on campus. And it was with Michael Newdown, the famous atheist who went to the Supreme Court trying to argue against the Pledge of Allegiance. I forget who his opponent was, but he was a televangelist. His name escapes me, but I just remember in profile, he looks almost exactly like John Kerry. If that helps find a name, I don't know.
I don't think I can come up with it, but yeah, I'll have to look that up.
Yeah. So they were debating. I didn't, find each of their, sets of arguments super impressive, but probably what also got me the most was I had been thinking about the sorts of problems that I had with just religion or with theism in abstract, because that's how I was approaching it. Not from the particular mythology of Catholic tradition, definitely not from the cult of the saints or anything like that. I wasn't going to ask what's your Mariology and see if that's consistent. It was just general theism. How do we explain the world? How do we make it consistent with observation? And I found the evangelist's arguments extremely woeful. And during Q&A, I asked about what was to me the biggest problem, the problem of evil. And when I found that like all he can resort to is the free will problem, free will defense, which doesn't even explain the least bit natural disaster, I was like, okay, I'm not religious anymore. That I remember that being the last day. And my one friend from class, we chatted for a little bit afterwards, but I do remember this, like, yeah, there's nothing here holding me in place. There's no intellectual reason for me to do that. There's no good responses to what I considered like the fundamental problem with the idea that there's an all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God who could just like that fix all the problems. And instead, we have a world that looks like, well, if things were just, running mechanically and nobody cares which direction it goes.
Yeah. Can I ask just to tag right under that? Has anyone like since your deconversion tried to present the gospel and pull you back in even after you left?
Other than one of the Mormon missionaries back in grad school, not too much, especially because I feel like I'm very sheltered. Like you go to grad school for physics, you aren't surrounded by too many religious people, though I do remember having one classmate who was evangelical as well, because I remember when I was presenting to them my book subject, he was in the audience, and he basically believes that the entire Bible is true, and the people who are arguing, for example, that Daniel wasn't written by Daniel or the Gospels written by the Gospel authors, those Bible scholars weren't taking the Bible seriously. And of course, I think that it's like these people, got PhDs in New Testament studies and possibly theology as well. They're in academic positions for this. Literally, their whole life revolves around it, and they're not taking it seriously. No. It's that they have taken it seriously, and they've come to very different conclusions. It's a really hard thing to believe that someone will learn Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, maybe as well as Syriac and other languages to study all these ancient texts and come to a position that, yeah, whoever wrote the first part of Daniel probably didn't write the second part of Daniel, and it definitely doesn't come from the 6th century. No, that comes from serious study, not from, this is what my pastor said. But even so, I've been very sheltered from evangelicalism in that sort of way. And even all the more surprising because when I left grad school and was getting my first jobs here in Massachusetts, I ended up working at 2 different Catholic institutions. And a lot of the good friends I made were Catholic or other sort of Protestant denominations. One of my really good friends from my previous college I was working at, he works at a Catholic university, but he's a Protestant himself. And he likes to actually have fun that on the anniversary when Martin Luther nailed up his theses, that he would go to the chapel on campus and nail up his copy of the 99 or whatever, was it 99 Theses up on the door there as well.
Yeah.
So, a little bit of fun with that.
Yeah, it's amazing when you talk about like people ignoring stuff, people who are great should know better because you can see these scholars have studied, but you write them off because they're not taking it seriously. It's amazing too, just the selectiveness that you get when you're becoming educated as an evangelical Christian who wants to go into ministry of some kind. I mean, I went to Bob Jones University and Lancaster Bible College and New Tribes Mission, now called Ethnos 360. But they train you, and yet when you get out and you actually study for real, you find out they did not teach you almost anything. They just taught you the party line. And when you mentioned Martin Luther, it made me think, when I dove into how anti-Semitic he was and how that influenced World War II, it just blew my mind. And I thought, I have never, ever heard anyone do anything but praise Martin Luther for what he did for the Protestant Reformation, kicking that off. And firmly fighting for justification by faith alone, and believing in the Bible alone, not the Bible plus the Pope, and praying to God alone through Jesus, not praying to the saints or to Mary, and thinking he was this bastion of faith and this hero of the faith. And then you find out he was the kind of guy that would easily burn down villages full of Jews just because they wouldn't believe like him. And his teachings influenced people even up to the last century in horrific ways. And amazing the things that you just don't know. And when you're a Christian, though, if you don't know them, it's like any subject. If you don't know that you don't know, you're kind of dangerous because you don't even know that you don't know. And it's amazing to me to get to a point where you can at least admit that and say, I know I have a lot to learn. I'm not even sure where I need to go to study, like what categories and what books I need to go to. I do know this. I don't know too much yet. Whatever I thought I knew that was sufficient for, life and knowledge and to obey God and honor Him. Whatever I thought I had was sufficient to make these decisions it's not enough. And I've described it a lot as if you have like a big dining room table and someone says, I want you in effect to, as if you were, holding onto a rope, swinging out over the flames of hell and say, there's like this is earth and this is heaven and hell's down here with the flames. And there's this rope that you're going to cling to that's going to get you from earth to heaven. You're going to swing out, as it were, over the flames of hell into eternity when you die on this rope. You better hold tight. And the knowledge to know what that rope is and what you're actually doing. If it's a table, they're like covering one little teeny corner. I'm like, well, where's the rest of the table? Like, what else? Why don't you put some information there? And they give you like a tenth or a hundredth of what you need to know to actually make an informed decision. And one of my biggest burdens is exactly this point of, like, if people really don't want to deconvert, they want to stay Christians, whatever. People are going to do what they're going to do, but at least give people the knowledge, give them the fairness, the fair treatment to say, let me tell you where this really came from. And when Christians say, don't look behind the curtain of the mystery cults, don't look under the curtain of the dying and rising gods, don't look under the curtain of the Homeric epics or Pythagoreanism and all this of Plutarch and Philo and Josephus. Like, don't look under those curtains. All you need is the Bible. I'm like, you're taking the books that we're trying to put on the table so you can study it. And books like yours about, even the way that astronomy and certainly astrotheology comes into play with the Bible. And they're just saying, ignore it. It's not relevant. I'm like, it's extremely relevant. And it frustrates me to death, but it's my passion. And I hope when it's my time to go, I can look back and think I've put a lot of information on the table to help people. Does that make sense?
I think I can say amen.
Well said. Well, I do want to ask, in terms of the gospel here, to wrap this piece of it up, when you do, I mean, you've obviously studied enough at this point to know what the evangelical Protestant Christian gospel is. There's bad news. You're a sinner. Sin deserves punishment. God's glory, His white hot holiness demands perfection. You and I can't give it, so we deserve His white hot holiness to basically punish us. And that punishment, if we don't have a way out to get our sin resolved, the punishment is eventually separation from God forever in hell. And whatever people want to call hell, whether it's annihilation or burning. But the good news is, of course, that there's a way to have peace with God, for this war between God because of our sin to end. And that is that Jesus took our punishment on the cross. His blood was shed for us. His death and resurrection was in our place. And if we are willing to turn from our sin and repent and turn to God and say, God, I freely accept your gift, not clinging in any way to my good works, but just saying, God, I accept your offer that you are here. You have provided a way. You have provided the spotless lamb, and His blood being shed is what can cover me. I accept that free gift of you covering my sin. And as it were, I'm still a sinner, but while I'm a sinner, I'm declared judicially righteous. Christ's righteousness covers me. It's as if you're in a court and someone says, you're guilty. And Jesus says, the guilt is real, but I'm going to take the punishment and effectively wipe your slate clean. That, when you think about people presenting that, especially to kids, where you're predicating it on the message of you're wicked, you're bad, you're guilty, you're worthless in and of yourself before God, you're deserving of punishment. How do you respond to that? And do you feel like that this is worth fighting, against that worldview, in the sense of, is it psychological manipulation to tell young people this, and to give them, of course, no information about where it came from, but just to tell them, this is the reality. You must bow your knee to this God, and His provision is wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And if you don't receive it, the outcome is really, really, really nasty forever. How do you respond to people that would preach that kind of message?
I would avoid the word manipulation, because that would imply the person knows it's not true, but trying to make you believe something anyways. Because the fact of the matter is, if parents are teaching their kids this, is because the parents deeply and fearfully believe that sort of message. And fearfully, especially because if they're really thinking that they could potentially have infinite punishment for doing this wrong, and all the more so their children that they love so dearly, that that's the future they want them to avoid and want to see them in paradise. So I can understand and completely sympathize with it. But it's definitely, I consider, a very harmful sort of belief system, because it also attaches with itself the idea that ultimately, what's the reason that we fall short? Because God says so, and it's why does it matter what God says? Might makes right. Okay, this already brings with it its own sort of moral system and political system, which also can be quite antithetical. That if you think might makes right, you probably also then lean authoritarian in political views. You probably believe in severe corporal punishment and all sorts of other things that we can tell from history and from experimental science. These things are not good for people or for developing children. So I look at this and see that, this probably also inspires all sorts of other behaviors and beliefs that are going to be detrimental to the person and also probably detrimental to society. When it comes to enacting my own political goals of taking over the world, it's usually the most evangelical Christian sorts that probably have the most opposition to what I view as what would probably be best for the country and for the world. And so, I see that sort of opposition and realize, if I want to change this, I probably need to change a lot of hearts and minds. Unfortunately, one-on-one conversations does not scale very well. The number of people I can talk one-on-one at a time is one. And since there's about 100 million people I need to chat with, it's a long, long journey if I'm going to go that way. But nonetheless, it seems like it is, I think, necessary to have these discussions to help move the conversation and move people's views to something that is more amenable to ultimately what's good for everyone, including those who believe in the first place. I feel that if you have these extremely negative views on what your value is in this life and what you need to do for the next life, you're going to do things in the here and now that are just not going to be the best for you or for others. It's a lose-lose, all based on a metaphysical win-win that doesn't exist.
Yeah. I sometimes hear the not objection, but the idea from atheists that the world in some ways seems like it's not ready for atheism in the sense that religion has become such a crutch, and that people can't imagine being good, where's your morality coming from? They can't imagine that if we got rid of God in our worldview, that we wouldn't all just descend into, a mob mentality and into chaos. Mad Max is here. Do you think that if the trend continues, that there's just more and more nuns, and when more nuns occurring, and the churches just keep on dying as the trends have been in the last, couple of decades, do you feel like there's going to be a real issue with people trying to figure out how to live their lives at that point? Or how do you think it's going to pan out?
It is worth noting that the nuns aren't necessarily atheists. In fact, only probably a minority identify in that sort of direction. They're most, they'll even use the phrase they might even say they believe in God or Jesus, but they're not religious.
Okay.
That a lot of it is also they just want to be away from the institutions, that they have seen them become so terrible and corrupt and politically motivated and greedy. It basically almost like the nuns are almost in sort of a way like a modern day Protestant. They're looking at the corrupt Catholic Church and want to be away from all of the indulgences that Bob Jones University or whatever institutions out there have been promoting, because say, hey, you're literally promoting racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, authoritarian kleptocracy. It's we don't want to be a part of that anymore, though we still want to hold on to what they think is important and ultimately related to all sorts of supernatural entities. And it's also worth noting that people of my generation, younger folks, it's not that they become nuns and now they drop the supernatural. There's a huge uptick in belief in things like astrology or ancient aliens or Atlantis or all sorts of things that are just not true, but have exploded in popularity. More than 50% now of millennials believe in astrology, even though when it comes to that subject, I think the best way to put it, it's the wrongest wrong that ever wronged. It's just incorrect in so many different ways, but now it's almost impossible to not scroll through Instagram with somebody talking about their horoscope or their sun sign. People seem to be very good, though, at finding meaning in just about anything. So I'm less worried about that. What more I'm worried about is, without necessarily any institutions people are attaching to, how many people will just be attached to small local gurus who can also lead to just small scale despotic little cults. Not every cult will grow up to become as large as, say, the Mormons or other churches, but it seems like with it being more and more decentralized, it just might become a more local phenomenon of people falling into supernaturalist groups that, well, can be somewhat harmful. It seems like people have now attached a lot of strong belief into QAnon. And what is it based on? Internet rumors and pretty much every other conspiracy theory for the last 300 years. I've tried looking at their charts where they try to relate everything together. And it's just, not only is it an intellectual nightmare, but it's also like a graphical design nightmare, just trying to follow all the lines of how they connect everything. Ultimately, we humans are very good at making patterns, even if there's nothing there. So I hope that humanists, atheists, just regular people can try to go out there and evangelize in ways that are productive and say, hey, here's what we can actually understand about the world, and here's why we know it. And importantly, what we need to be promoting is the idea that if you want to know what's true, you need to actually critically examine and apply that to everything, including your own moral compass, your own beliefs, which is very difficult. And I would hope that more and more we can try to incorporate that into any future organizations of religion or non-religion that we can have. In the end, who knows? It might even be the case that eventually God finally, proves himself, and I'll join up with whatever group that might be. But I'm still going to keep what critical apparatuses I have in my brain. I want to be open-minded without it falling out.
Yeah, absolutely. That's good. I like that. Well said. In terms of going back to your story, you mentioned that one time frame where you kind of acknowledged that you were done with religion. Were there any hard issues in terms of realizing the ramifications? Like, had you been very attached, for example, to the idea that you would be living forever, for sure? Obviously we still could, we don't have evidence for it, but it's possible we could live on after we die. But just that certainty of, I know where I'm going. I know that, Uncle so-and-so died. I know I'm going to see him again, all that kind of thing. I know that, Aunt so-and-so had cancer and she's going to have a glorified body that's perfect forever. All these grievances and sadnesses and sicknesses are going to be resolved in heaven. Just the beauty of it all, the beauties of if you got into Revelation, the beauty of the actual city, how beautiful Jerusalem's going to be, the new heavens and the new earth, all these kind of, what dreams may come kind of thing. If you've seen that movie from Robin Williams, the idea, all this dream world that's going to become reality when you die. Did it hurt your emotional status, your heart at all to see some of these implications? And what were those implications that meant the most to you?
From what I remember, because again, I didn't even really know the Christian myth all that well, honestly. It's amazing to be a Catholic, to see Jesus up on the cross every Sunday when going to church, but never actually thinking, why is he there? And vaguely remembering, and there's that story that he comes out later, but it never felt so emphasized that it was actually a part of my own thought process about, here's something that literally happened in history. So to me, religion was always just more of an abstraction. And one of the things that probably also kept me holding on to it for some time was the moral questions, like how does morality work outside of any sort of theistic system? And I remember when I was starting to get really interested in philosophy and having philosophy classes, the first class I actually had, it's a bit weird. It was a class on modern political philosophy. Sounds like it should be unrelated to theism. But among the books that our teacher had us read was Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals. What does it have to do with political theory? I still don't know. But I remember reading that book and Nietzsche's account for explaining how The Romans had a kind of morality, the Jews had another, and it's because of this master-slave dynamic. And when I read that, it's not necessarily, I don't think it's history is necessarily right, but I looked at it, it's like, wait, this is an account of how we could actually have our own moral sensibilities, and it's completely historic. It is not based on any sort of God belief. It's what virtues and things like that we want to emphasize. And that's like, in one way, when the scales fell from my eyes and you realize this is how morality actually works. This is actually how it's created, how it comes up from the human, not top down. And that, and along with continuing contemplations on the problem of evil, the fact that our world looks completely naturalistic, that even the deism that I held on to fell away once I realized it just didn't seem to conform with the universe that we have. Again, if there's a perfect God creating a perfect universe, why earthquakes, tsunamis, parasites? Why is it that 99.99999% of the universe is instantly hostile to any form of life? That is not the expectation of a perfect designer for a universe that's supposed to be wonderful and exuberantly great for conscious being like ourselves. No, it's like a world that life occasionally happens. In one particular case, it got smart enough to realize, hey, my foot really hurts when I hit that rock. Now it's infected. Oh, great, I'm going to be dead in a week. That's not the universe you necessarily expect from a God creator that can literally make any set of laws he, she, it desires.
Yeah. So when you were thinking through that, and it kind of hits you that you weren't even a deist anymore, was there any level in which that was a shock to your system, or did it feel pretty much like a natural flow to whatever you would call yourself at that point, an atheist or agnostic?
At that point, like, because it was kind of slow, it felt like a fairly easy transition. Like I said, it was literally by the end of a debate that I had gone from probably a God to almost certainly not. The only time I remember reading something theistically related and actually just having like an, oh my God sort of sense, was actually when I was reading Spinoza's Ethics. And if you've ever read it, he tries to like arguing like a geometer. Here's my definitions, axioms, and then here is something here's my statement, and here's my proof for it, and tries to prove it just like you're reading Euclid's Elements. It has that same sort of flow. A lot of the times, like, the language is a little bit hard to follow, but I remember like I was literally in an airport and reading like the last chapters, and he was like saying, and here's how I'm going to prove that you are immortal. And you become more immortal by being more rational and reasonable. And I remember like getting to the end of that and just shivering with the thoughts like, this is immortality. He has proven immortality. And all I have to do is think. If I go back to it, I don't know if I would have the same sort of feeling. And also, while Spinoza, has proofs for God, many will describe saying Spinoza is basically a pantheist, that the universe and God are one and the same sort of thing. That Einstein's God is Spinoza's God, which is not the least bit personal. It's just basically existence and the laws of nature, which is ultimately then why he was saying you could be immortal. The more and more rational you are, the more you are in tune with the laws of nature. And so the more that those will carry on, because the laws of nature are themselves eternal. I think that was the basic argument he made. But beyond that, I've taken most of these things kind of in stride, and the great eureka moments, the aha moments, have mostly taken place in more my explorations of science and history, where we can actually make discoveries. In theism, it seems like we're done making discoveries. There's probably not a God, and that's it.
A few more questions, and I do want to get some time for your book here, but just I can put a few more on the table for kind of these kind of feels both like rapid fire questions, but also some kind of random questions, but they're kind of related to, I think, the community in terms of questions that we would ask someone like yourself. When you look at someone who, you mentioned you'd seen some of my videos in preparation for our interview, some of the people, myself included, we were in this all the way. When you read people's stories or hear people's stories, do you feel like you can in any way sympathize with them, or does it feel like it's just so bizarre? Like, I get comments, of course, as the person that does this platform, I read the comments that come into my videos, and quite often, a lot of them are very nice and generous, but quite often, at least a couple times a week, I get something that effectively says, you were stuck in this for 43 years. Are you an idiot? And I'll respond, if I do it, I'll just say, look, this is a testimony to the effectiveness of childhood brainwashing. If you tell a kid early enough, thoroughly enough, with complete blinders on and complete sheltering and no other opposing voices, and you list it with the ultimate carrot and stick of heaven and hell, and it's kind of like an addiction, like a drug. Like, if you go to your parent and say, hey, this is my pretty drawing, do you like it? And of course they say, oh, Tim, that's great, good job, you're an amazing artist. It feels good. And you're doing that with this father up in heaven saying, God, I'm reading your book, I'm praying, I'm giving my money. He's like, oh, well done, well done, well done. It's like an addiction that, endorphins are hitting on a spiritual level. When you look at people like myself, who it took 43 stinking years to get out of this stuff, and other people, it's a lot later than that. And we're, of course, angry at the time we lost. But when you look at people like that, how do you see their stories? Like, what hits you as you hear people that couldn't get out for that long?
It honestly doesn't surprise me. And frankly, it makes sense to me, because if you came up to me right now, Tim, and you said your father is not actually your father, and that person you've been calling dad doesn't even love you, I would just dismiss you right out of hand. And if you tried even presenting evidence of these sorts of things, I would probably get violent that you would even try to approach me with something so vile in my mind. Now, I think I have very good reason to believe my father is my father. I haven't gone and done a paternity test, but everyone says I look like my dad. In fact, now my haircut kind of matches his. That's mostly my wife's choice. But nonetheless, I can just imagine that someone approaching me with something that deep to me, that important to how I've grown up, and even approaching me with that, it just seems disgusting. So not only do I have sympathy, it just makes total sense to me. If that's, the environment you grew up in, and you've never encountered anything that would actually make you question those underlying assumptions, why would you give up those beliefs? It's not like, every day we just randomly decide, what, I'm not going to believe some fundamental law of physics today. Let's see what happens. No, you continue with those sorts of beliefs until you basically smack so hard against something that it forces you to try to reconcile with what you've just run into. Cognitive dissonance itself can be quite powerful, and you'll still try to hold to that original position, but something's got to change eventually. But if you can go through life without encountering anything that really forces you to have to reconsider, of course you're going to continue down that same route. Not only does it not surprise me, it would be a weirder thing if our brains just randomly switch theologies every few months. So that it took you 43 years isn't any surprise. I guess the more question is, how long do you think it took encountering contrary ideas for you to switch? Like, it probably wasn't happening all 43 years of your life. It was probably like, maybe the last 5-ish years of that time?
Yeah, basically. I do at times, just for the fun of it, try to think back, like, were there any seeds that were planted? One of the earliest ones I remember was maybe when I was 25-ish. I've got these really amazing friends who do greyhound rescue, and I went with them to one of their big events. A lot of wineries are open to people bringing their greyhounds in, because greyhounds are usually very calm dogs if it's just greyhounds only. And so they go to these wineries and they call it the Grape Hounds Wine Tour. And I'm very good friends with the founders of it. And so one of these events, we're there, and it's just amazing time. It's all wrapped up now, and we've kind of got a few hours before we're all heading back home. And I'm just sitting in this hotel lobby with this guy, Larry. And I know that he goes to like a liberal church, which to an evangelical Christian, a liberal church is, you might as well be you're going to hell. There's no value in that to me. Because he told me, oh yeah, our woman pastor used to bless the animals. I was like, hell no, that's not a church. That's a social club. And so I was really, really concerned for him as a Christian. And I just sat down with him. I said, Larry, where are you with God? And of course I was concerned to share the gospel. And he said, well, let me ask you this. And this is all he did. We didn't talk in depth. He said, let me ask you this. Does it make sense that if God wanted to reveal himself to the world, that he would go to one little tribe in one little part of the world, as opposed to announcing himself everywhere? He didn't go to the Chinese and Japanese, and he didn't go to the people in Australia, whoever was in Australia at that time, and all these other places. He went to one little tribe in one little section of the world. Does that make sense? Wouldn't he have shown himself to all the tribes everywhere? And he just said, that doesn't make sense to me. And looking back, of course, I had answers, I probably had 10 answers ready to give him, another 20 so-ones. But looking back, I think, yeah, that's a really good question. And I wonder if that did eat at me at all. But yeah, it took me a long time. The thing that sparked mine was the genocide issue. When we're singing this kids song as you do with the kids, raising them to be little soldiers for Jesus. One of the songs that you would have learned, I'm sure, if you grew up in a Christian environment, was called Joshua Fought the Battle of Jericho. And it's just about the Jericho story. And they walk around, the walls come tumbling down. It's a fun kid song. The kids have fun. They're spinning and laughing and giggling. But I know in the story, what happens next is, land theft, genocide, child brides, and all that stuff, slavery. And as I'm singing this song with the kids, which does not include the bad stuff, it's just the fun parts, but I'm thinking they're going to at some point know what comes next. And that was very unsettling to me. Like, am I encouraging them to believe in a worldview that allows genocide to be acceptable? And I'm like, okay, so I've basically been defending this, passively, but effectively. I'm okay with God doing genocide. Am I okay with passing that on? And it was the first time when I realized it's like your links in a chain. It's funny, the concept would have transferred in Christian terms for sins. They call it generational curses a lot, or something like it. But they would say, your great granddaddy was an alcoholic, used to beat his wife, and granddaddy did the same thing. Your daddy did the same thing. You get to break the generational curse. You stop it now. Or, this person was divorced and they got married, their kids got divorced, you stay married, whatever. Break the generational curse. And it kind of became a similar theme to me of saying, okay, the generational curse here is that, number one, generational curses don't exist. But if I want to carry the metaphor, generational curse is Christianity. And it took me at that point, I would have never even at that point said, I'm going to become an atheist at this. When this is said and done, because to me, the questions of there has to be something or why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there some kind of order to it? And why do we feel like we're made for something more? Why do we feel like there's, like C.S. Lewis would have said, we're made for a better world? We feel like we're made for that celestial city. The idea of thinking, and also the beauty of life, like when you look at a newborn baby or a sunset, you think there's beauty here. This isn't just random math. This is artistic, beautiful math. And those things combined in a way that I would have said atheism is not on the table in any way, shape, or form. And I will admit, this may not be the best way to have approached it, but when I left, like when I realized who the Yahweh character really was and how they made up Jesus, once I got truly educated in the mythology, I didn't have any attraction to look at the other gods. And maybe I should have. And I've heard people say that, like, you should have investigated other gods first, not because they wanted me to become a different religion, but they just said, all you've done is you've debunked Christianity. That doesn't make the other religions debunked. But for me, it was like, I felt so deceived and so disgusted at what had happened, that I was like, I don't have any interest in looking at any other gods. I don't think this is real. And I think the other ones, they just sound on the surface, at least, like they're just as made up, if not worse. And so I was fully out after about 18 months. But it did take a while. And the genocide didn't do it. The land theft, slavery stuff. It was I had to learn the mythology. Once I learned that was enough to get me out.
And I would actually even say, by learning the various mythologies, I think that does provide reason to be more dismissive of religions and supernatural beliefs in general, because you can say, okay, Christianity is one sort of this. You don't believe that. And one of the reasons you might also say is not only because of the various terrible things in the Holy Book, but also we live in a world where we now know we can actually explain things naturalistically. All supernaturalistic religions have to be in contradiction to that. So the simple fact that we don't go around the world and we can have demonstrable miracles, and anytime somebody does claim so and they actually try testing it, it falls flat, because James Randi kept $1 million to the day he died, for example. It's been nothing but religion showing that they can make extraordinary claims and all claim absolution to what their traditions are and what you should be following, or otherwise they just have no actual claims, but they just have supernatural beliefs. And we look around the world and we see, hey, that stuff doesn't add up, and we can usually explain where these beliefs come from. I think that is sufficient to be dismissive of these religions in general. So we don't have to explore 10 different denominations of Hinduism. We don't have to compare Shinto Buddhism to Zen to Mahayana to Theravada. It's like, no. They are all having the same underlying assumption that naturalism is false, but everything we can tell is that the universe follows natural laws and can exist without any extra help.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, I totally agree. It just sets up a much more strict threshold for burden of proof, for sure. I was curious, again, just kind of asking some questions that come up a lot in conversations with people that have deconverted. I know you didn't have as big of a radical deconversion per se, but one of the questions that comes up is, what do we do about society? And I asked you a little bit about it, but I wanted to move it just for a second to politics. Does it scare you at all? And I'm not talking about different political groups, just in general, anybody of either side. Does it scare you at all that some of the people at the highest levels of authority, the people that make the Supreme Court decisions, many of them, the people that have the codes to the worst weapons in the world, that they believe that Yahweh is real and that Jesus's blood is real, that this world's not our home, that we're just passing through? Does it scare you at all that mythology has invaded at every level, but especially at those levels? And do you feel like there's some kind of obligation that those of us who have escaped have to try to move this thing forward? Because I'm obviously optimistic and hopeful that we'll, as a society, move forward, that we'll make the good choices. But I could see a history of the future that includes people doing some really nasty stuff in the name of Jesus. Like, we have to fight for Jesus. And I could see, I mean, this is really probably a stretch, but I could see a fringe possibility of Christian nationalism taking over this country if the chips fell the right way. How do you feel about that in terms of being not necessarily politically involved where you run for office, but just being in these discussions and saying, this feels like we're just having some random discussions as friends talking about it. But you know what? Looking back in history, we might be influencing the next president of the United States or the next Supreme Court justice, who might be a teenager right now, and they're going to watch some of this stuff and eventually get elected. We might be influencing toward a more secular society, or our lack thereof might be saying, keep it going, keep the Christian nationalism on the table. How do you feel about all that?
Well, when it comes to the future I want, I think my background says like the future I want us to go towards. And yes, that sort of future requires us to, abandon some of the worst tendencies in our leadership. I mean, it is an actual fact that those who have the sorts of religious commitments will push us in directions when it comes to, like, say, national or international policy that can be overall detrimental to what we want. I mean, our policy in particular to the Middle East and Israel is strongly guided by beliefs about the end of the world, apocalypse, and things like that. When President Trump had moved the embassy to Jerusalem, that was provocative against the Palestinians, but also was very much in line with what various Christian nationalists wanted, because, well, they ultimately hoped to reestablish ultimately the original Jewish cult, so that way it can also just get destroyed, so that way Jesus can come and bring every terrible thing that Revelation has in it, plus some. It's hard to describe everything that happens in Revelation because it's such an acid trip to read, and it must have been even more of an acid trip to write in many ways. But
it may have literally been an acid trip to write.
Yeah, I think it's written, at least, I shouldn't say written more coherently, because usually students who go to seminary and have to like read Revelation, the first thing they have to encounter is all the grammar mistakes.
Yeah.
That might also be on purpose, because like when Ezekiel has his vision, also the Hebrew grammar gets messed up. So that, for all I know, that could be part and parcel, or it's just he can't spell good because it's not his native language. It's hard to know. But either way, we know that there are politicians who are going to be guided by their strong theistic beliefs, and it will hurt us. uh, the vast majority of opposition, say, to abortion access is religiously motivated. Not completely, obviously, but we do know that is a big chunk of it. I mean, heck, it is the thing that helped motivate the religious right in the 80s to become unified. Even though if you went back to the early 70s and the Roe v. Wade result came out, most Protestants, including like Billy Graham, were like, okay, this was mostly a Catholic issue anyways. So we know that religion and politics have gone hand in hand and have sometimes led to some really detrimental things and might lead to more detrimental things for our country as well as for others. So yeah, we do need to be doing things to push and say, hey, your religious convictions, while you might find them noble and necessary to your own political and moral philosophy, you need to step back and say, look at what you are doing to the rest of us and realize your ruling is theocratic. If you're ultimately going to basically say, we need to be supporting Israel for the sake of bringing on the end times, holy fucking shit, you are going to be hurting the rest of the world to try to bring on something that, even according to your own theology, will hurt the entire world.
Yeah.
So,
and even related to climate change too, with the
plenty of people who basically say, to me, there's the positive side and negative side when it comes to religion, that it's immensely interpretable. It is so easy to find religious people who will read Genesis and say, this is a guidebook for us to be environmental conservatives. And I can follow that logic and I can understand it. And it also, comports with my own sense of what we should be doing with the environment. And others who will say, they'll read the exact same book and say, we need to drill, baby, drill. It's the fact that you can get either interpretation out, and one isn't necessarily better than the other, that makes you realize, okay, there's a reason that we should be opposing religion or religious thinking, because if it can get you to any sort of determination of what you should be doing politically, it isn't a good source. And the fact that it then makes you dig in your heels and say, no, this is my God-given belief that we must destroy or we must protect the environment. Clearly, this is not going to allow us to operate rationally and diplomatically. Once you've basically hit moral stakes on what might just be monetary policy, and literally say it could be the end of the world depending on what choices we make here, and you're not going to make that clearly and rationally based on the evidence and the best scientific ways of thinking, yes, we are going to continue to hurt ourselves with that sort of religiosity, mythology, superstition.
Well said. It's funny when you said the end of the world, I couldn't help but not think of the first 30 seconds of the movie Armageddon, where they're playing "It's the End of the World" and as we know it. I feel fine. They do feel fine because they think it's that God's going to make a new one, and it's like, why worry about this one? He's going to create a new one soon anyway. It's hard to even fathom, but it's, in some ways it's weird when you get away from it long enough, like I do. You're like, I can't imagine thinking like that, but then I'm like, wait a second, I did think like that for so long, and it's a really weird experience. But there's so many things about Christianity now that are just like, that's so weird, and yet for so long I was in it, and it's been happening a lot more often, where I'll just think, I can't believe Christians think like that, and I'll have to correct myself and say, you totally understand how they thought because you were in it. But it's kind of a nice thing too, to get so disgusted by what I used to think that I feel like I'm a different person now, which is really cool. I like to say I've been truly saved, truly born again. I did want to, I appreciate your entertaining all my questions there. One more thing I meant to add to what you just said about abortion. I'm sure you're aware of this, but just as a passing reference, the Bible has one clear passage that talks about abortion. And it's how if your husband is jealous, the baby that's in you might not actually be his, how to go to the priest, and he'll use this magic dust water that he makes from the dust of the temple, and you drink it as the woman. And if you've been unfaithful, the baby will abort, and your womb will miscarry. And it's amazing to me that the one time that if God was so pro-life, so to speak, and anti-abortion, the one time he could have made it crystal clear, instead what he does is that in this one example, this one passage, he says, here's the recipe, a very nasty recipe for how to perform an abortion. And it's just, you can comment if you want to, but I just want to bring that up. It never ceases to amaze me.
That's actually not the only passage that supports the idea that, God doesn't see a fetus as fully human. I think it's in Numbers. It's one of the laws about, it's either, I'll have to check, but if you kill a woman, that's considered murder, and your penalty is what murderers get. But if you cause a woman to miscarry, like if you, hit her stomach so hard or something like that, you have to pay the husband a fine, which clearly shows here's what you do with killing a person. Here's what you do with killing a fetus, and they're not the same level of punishment. Usually you kill a person, you kill a fetus, it's a fine. That basically shows it's a misdemeanor. It is not considered murder according to the great lawgiver. So there are multiple passages that show that not necessarily that God is a lover of abortion, but he certainly does not consider it the same sort of moral evil that is actual murder. And a fetus isn't fully human. And I think that's also often Jewish tradition, that you aren't human fully until you've taken your first breath.
And certainly, in a generic sense too, you could just say the Yahweh character is extremely destructive and murderous himself, including, two babies. If the flood had been real, if it was, the way that it happens in the story with Noah, then he effectively killed, thousands or hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of babies in that flood. He certainly kills a lot of them with Egypt and the final plague there before Pharaoh lets Moses and the people go. And certainly later on with the conquest of Canaan, the genocide that occurs where they have to kill all the Amalekites and all that, and other passages that even more generically just talk about how blessed is the man who dashes the heads of the babies of God's enemies on a rock. And it's amazing to me. I'm not saying that that's the only thing we should be thinking about in this discussion about abortion, but if they want to go to Yahweh as a defender of it, it's not a good starting point.
It is very hard to get a strong biblical basis for that. There were other early Christian texts, as I understand, that were more explicitly anti-abortion, but they didn't make it into the canon. So if you want to rely on that, you're a heretic.
Yeah, that's interesting. I did not know that. I'll look that up. That's really fascinating. I've been trying to get into.
I forget which texts they are, but I remember Bob Price bringing that up. And he's an atheist himself, but also very staunchly anti-abortion. Yeah. But I don't remember which texts he said in particular were early Christian ones that were also anti-abortion.
That's interesting. Yeah, you would have thought they would have left those in for sure. Well, I did want to leave maybe the last third of our time here to talk about your book. I'm just going to bring it up here to kick us off to this section. Again, The Star of Bethlehem, A Skeptical View. Could you give us a little background on just kind of what you do with astronomy in general and where your passions have lain in the last, so I'm using that word, that verb form of the verb lain correctly, where your passions are for astronomy and kind of how it led you into studying the Star of Bethlehem, and dive into your book a little bit.
Absolutely. So this will actually take me back to deist Aaron, where when I started at Michigan State, I wanted to try to get a part-time job there. And to me, because I was going there, my goal was I'm going to graduate and become an astrophysicist. I want to learn about space and especially cosmology, the origin, structure of the universe, the really big questions, as big as they get. None of these tiny little planets. No. Give me galaxies. Give me superclusters. Come on. So when I started at Michigan State, I tried getting a job at the local planetarium. When I first went there, basically that was a no-go. But in one of my astronomy classes, they said, hey, we need an assistant for the upcoming Astronomy 101 course. Does someone want a TA? And by happenstance, I'm able to get that position and then start working as a show presenter at the same planetarium. So on the back end, I was able to get the job I was originally trying to get. So for several years, I was a show presenter there at the Michigan State Abrams Planetarium. And it was during their holiday season. They have their traditional holiday show. And ultimately, this show goes back to a version that goes back all the way to about 1930 that has been updated, since then, especially in terms of the kinds of special effects we have or the narration. But nonetheless, this is a show that tries in part explaining what was the star in the Christmas story. So for the viewers who may not be may not know the nativity story, or more importantly, might only know the mixture of the two different nativity stories as they are in the movies. The basic story comes from the Gospel of Matthew, where in chapter 2, Jesus has already been born to Mary, apparently without any sexual intercourse with Joseph, but apparently that was all resolved. But in the beginning of chapter 2, we are told that Herod the Great is king at the time, and lo and behold, these wise men or magi from the east come and say, "Where is the king of the Jews? We saw his star. He's been born. We want to come here and worship him." Herod, of course, is like, "Wait a minute. I'm king. This isn't very good." So apparently Herod was troubled, and according to the story, all of Jerusalem was troubled by this news as well. And eventually learned from them that said, "Yeah, we saw this great star. We're trying to find him." Herod asked the scribes and Pharisees, or the scholars there, to say, "Okay, where's the Messiah supposed to be born?" They say Bethlehem. Magi then marched to Bethlehem, and lo and behold, the star, which they had seen before at its rising in the east, depending on the translation, and went before them until it stood over where the child was. They have great joy, enter the house, give him gifts, and then they get told in a dream to, in modern parlance, get out of Dodge. The Holy Family then does the same thing, avoids being murdered by Herod, and then they live happily forever, ever. I forget the rest. Don't spoil it for me. So the show at the planetarium was trying to explain, what could this star have been? Can we identify it, and can we then figure out, the exact dates of these things? Because with the power of science, we can backtrack and figure out exactly where the planets were at any place in the world, where they would have been seen at any given time. That we have now advanced so much with our planetary theory that for thousands of years in the future and the past, we can know pretty much exactly where the planets were and will be. So can we use that to reconstruct what the sky would have looked like at around the time of Jesus' birth and figure out what could have been seen? The show that we presented was one that started becoming popular in planetariums back in the 80s, because it was actually pushed by the Griffith Observatory and the director there, and basically then helped spread around the country as well. So it might be the most popular planetarium show now, saying it was this particular extremely close conjunction of Jupiter and Venus. So conjunction technically is when two planets have the same line of longitude, that you could draw a line between them going from north to south. But this conjunction was so close, they almost would look like one star. So it's a particularly amazing view. And to me, as deist Aaron, seeing literally the laws of universe crank away and present the miracle story in that way, I'm just like, no, this is exactly how a God ought to operate. This is beautiful and amazing. I then remember going home for the holidays and then watching a television special and like, oh, we're going to discuss the Star of Bethlehem. And they present a different theory. Huh? And then I find out, oh, there's lots of different theories out there. Okay. How do we reconcile this? And why are we presenting this theory without acknowledging, oh yeah, everyone thinks their theory is right. Everyone else thinks everyone else's is wrong. How are we adjudicating this? What's the consensus position? How do we actually get to that? And basically that's when my journey begins. And especially once I started becoming much more biblically literate. While at college, I actually take classes in Greek and Latin so I can actually access the text, because I could tell a lot of the people making claims about the Star of Bethlehem could not read the language. Like literally some of the books I'm reading, they'll say they'll cite the Greek text and they literally can't tell the difference between nouns and verbs. So I'm like, okay, I need to make sure I don't make this sort of mistake. I need to protect myself from goofing in that sort of way. I'll make mistakes, sure, but not that one. I've seen some particularly weird errors where people just make up verb tenses, literally make them up.
Trying to make a case about what was actually happening.
Exactly, yeah. And I basically, a couple of years in exploring, and I realized, oh, most Bible scholars think this story is completely fiction. Oh, if you go and read the text literally, this is clearly a magical star. Oh, everyone up until basically the modern period thought this was a magic star. So I first wrote an article about this for Sky and Telescope back in 2007, which is a major popular astronomy magazine. I continued exploring it and wrote an article about the entire history of interpretation of the story from the 2nd century to modern times. Then my friend Jonathan Pierce invited me to try to write a whole book on the subject, which buy 10. If you buy 10 books, it's more effective that way.
Can I ask a question about what your research? Yeah. Did you find other stories that are similar with other gods or emperors or special teachers of the past? Like, was there any kind of comparative mythology that came into the equation?
Yes, definitely. I definitely wanted to compare with that. So the comparisons that I find to be strongest in texts outside of the Bible, the one that is perhaps the most interesting to me is the other examples of guiding stars in Greco-Roman literature. And probably the best example, the one that would have had the greatest sway at the time Matthew wrote, was the story of the guiding star of Aeneas. It's described in chapter 2 of Virgil's The Aeneid that I believe it was Aeneas' father is basically praying for some sort of, help and guide to the fleeing Trojans. And then this bright star comes in, flaming tail, right at like treetops level, shooting across and going west. And they're supposed to follow that star. And in other legends as well, this star was supposed to be like literally Venus guiding them all the way to Italy. So that way they could found Rome and then eventually the Roman Empire. Virgil's entire Aeneid is basically this giant puff piece to Caesar Augustus and why he has the legitimacy to rule and why he's like the best thing since sliced bread for the Roman people, which would have been pretty impressive. There wasn't sliced bread back then.
Is it correct to say too, as a side note, that the Aeneid is based in part on the Iliad and Odyssey?
Oh, absolutely. It is purposefully trying to mimic and even reverse some of the things. So, for example, one of the famous stories of Odysseus is that he has to sail between Scylla and Charybdis, these two monsters that get too close to one and you'll lose a few of your crewmates, get too close to the other, you'll lose your entire ship. And Odysseus is reasonably smart and loses some crewmen, not everything. Aeneas does the same trip. He goes to the same part and has to deal with the same monsters and doesn't lose a single sailor. So this is an example of Aeneas or of Virgil trying to rewrite the story and make their heroic founder even more clever, even more capable, even more dutiful than the Greek figure that they're trying to emulate. So sometimes there's obvious cases like that. Other ones where you have to look really side by side to see the comparisons, what they're doing. But you can definitely see that Virgil basically has absorbed the Homeric epic. So that way he can rechurn it out and make an epic story for the founding of the Roman people. And of course, the dynasty.
Have you happened to dive in at all to the work of people like Dennis MacDonald with how they do the same thing with the New Testament? Yeah, that's. I won't get into that because I don't want to sidetrack us, but it's fascinating to me how that same thing carries through.
I will point out that I've had a little bit of conversation with Dennis even on this subject, and he doesn't really see any significant connection between Homeric or Virgilian stories and the Bethlehem Star. And to be fair, there's like very little linguistic evidence you can point to, and all the more so because the Aeneid is in Latin, the Gospels are in Greek. It's really hard to find borrowed words in that way because they're literally different languages.
Yeah.
But I've been exploring this more and more to see if I can make a case that's a little bit stronger, but ultimately it is a possible but not probable case I could make for that sort of genealogical influence. But basically, there are other cases of guiding stars that are talked about at the same time. There was supposed to have been a star that led another Greek general to Sicily, a guy by the name of Timoleon, that he was also supposed to have been led by a star during even a storm. So it definitely couldn't have been a star in the sky. It was literally supposed to be described like one of the Castor Pollux brothers guiding them along the way. So magical guiding stars was not that uncommon. If you want to look towards a Jewish analog, most people will point to like the pillar of fire that led the Hebrews to the Holy Land, though I don't find that connection very strong because pillar of fire, star in the sky, not quite the same. Also, it was a pretty terrible guide. It took him 40 freaking years. Come on. So there is, of course, the most probable Jewish influence is the so-called star prophecy from Numbers 24:17. We know this was a very popular prophecy in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in rabbinic literature. One of the major Jewish generals against the Romans in the 130, Simon Bar Kokhba, Literally, his name is supposed to mean Bar Kokhba is like son of the star. He's like saying, I am the star prophecy come true, and I'm gonna lay waste to the Romans. It didn't work out that way, but we know this prophecy was used for messianic figures. That it gets used for another one doesn't seem all that strange.
It's interesting. Do you, and if you're going to get into this in a few minutes, we can, I don't want to jump ahead too much, but do you see some of these stories in the Gospels potentially as originally purely parable, like where the point is not to say, did this really happen? Was this person really alive? Or if there was a person that was alive, are they referring to that person? Or is it possible that some of this is just a parable? Like I'm diving into some, with typology where Christians would say, God kind of orchestrated the state of Israel or the Jews of the Old Testament to do certain things and to experience certain things. And they were considered a kind of like a mild prophecy of what would happen with Jesus. So, they go through the waters of the Red Sea, and then they go into the desert for 40 years. Jesus goes to the waters of the Jordan River and then goes to the desert for 40 days. And they both are tempted to, make the wrong choice against God. And of course, Israel fails. And that's why they're there for 40 years. Jesus makes the right choice and all these things. And I've seen a lot of those lists where people say, ancient Israel did this in this order. And Jesus did this in this order. And from a Christian's perspective, you're just saying, well, it's wonderful. God kind of orchestrated it to, prefigure Christ. We would now say, well, it looks like it's actually some kind of mimesis. They're copying the motifs, and they're making Jesus into like a new Israel, a parable of the salvation of God, something like that. Do you see the stars as potentially a parable, or do you think that they literally had people originally claiming that they actually saw this star?
Yeah, so we ultimately have to get to what do we think are the motivations to the gospel author, the Gospel of Matthew author. Now, of course, since we don't even know who wrote the book, and there's also significant uncertainty when he wrote it, it's very hard then to say what his motivations were. But I would probably lean towards he knew he was not telling history, that ultimately his motivations were trying to tell a story to convince people why Jesus was theologically important, and the techniques he was using were the same sorts of techniques you actually find, for example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls with the techniques. So, for example, there are the Pesherim, the technique that you're supposed to basically like combine various passages from the Old Testament to try to create a new understanding, try to derive that. So one of the articles I was reading recently, I think makes this case well, that in particular, huge chunks of Matthew's gospel is a pesher on the prophecies of Isaiah. So, for example, if we go to the nativity story, there are these 5 quotations of prophecy, and you look at them, they almost feel random and like almost like forced into place. Like there's the virgin birth prophecy, which in the original Hebrew isn't even about a virgin woman. It's ultimately just about a young woman giving birth at a certain time, and that was supposed to be the signal to the king that things are going to be okay, or things like that. The Rachel weeping for her lost children, that seems somewhat random. How does that have any relationship to the slaughter of the innocents? How do we square those circles? We see also like the prophecy that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem. The prophecy as quoted doesn't exist in the Old Testament. It looks like it's a patchwork of a couple different verses. It almost looks random. So there's 2 ways you could approach that. You could say, oh, Matthew thinks this actually happened, and he's desperately trying to find anything to fit to explain that, to give it some sort of Old Testament pedigree. But the article I was reading recently argues that with the Pesher technique, these verses are not actually random. They actually thematically connect to the couple of chapters in Isaiah that he's quoting. So in Isaiah, there's like, basically it's all about like the return of Israel and that renewed hope from that. In particular, coming back from exile. How does the story of Jesus start? With a super boring genealogy. But the crux of that genealogy is the time between David and the Babylonian exile, and then from the Babylonian exile to Jesus. So the exile is right there in the middle and is supposed to be important to that. What is the Isaiah passage that he's ultimately making these quotes from or trying to riff on? The return from exile and God's promise to that. The child being born, this was supposed to be God's deliverance. And like the author of this article pointing out, like, and here's how all these various other verses connect with that. And so you realize this is actually much more genius in that sort of way. You realize they're following this sort of technique of deriving things from the Old Testament, which conversely means if these verses are not randomly chosen, but they actually have to conform to this particular structure, then the story itself has to conform to that as well. And then it realized, okay, this looks much more like deliberate storytelling and story creating rather than passing on well-known traditions. And frankly, it's hard to believe that they were well-known because the other major story of the birth of Jesus looks like going out of its way to say, no, it didn't happen this way. It's how it really happened.
Yeah. And
also, according to the story, took place 10 years later under different political circumstances and no having to flee Herods or anything like that. It's, you know, arguable if the two gospels knew each other. I lean towards Luke knew Matthew, and it was just like, no, I do not like this. I'm rewriting this whole thing from the ground up.
Well, can I ask
now? Yeah,
you mentioned the idea that they knew they were writing a story. I don't know if you'd call it a novel or whatever, but some kind of story to prove that Jesus was important for the salvation of Israel. At that point, one question that comes to my mind is if they knew they were making it up, even if it was very theologically significant, and if that happened, you know, whatever, 50%, 75% of the Gospels, that they're just making stuff up to make a point, where they're looking at some Old Testament story, you know, that something Moses did or Joshua did, something even Jonah did, and these experiences from these Old Testament people, and he's rewriting them, or he's copying from the Homeric epics of something Odysseus did, and he's repeating it for the Jesus story. The idea to say that these authors, whoever they were, that they're trying to convince you that Jesus is important and significant, how does that work if they know that, I mean, they obviously know that they're copying from somewhere else. And I know that Dr. McDonald's been very clear to talk about it's not plagiarism, that this was just how you did your work at that time. You would take an epic and you'd kind of craft a version of it that emphasized or contrasted in some way to make a point. You know, it was a different story in part, at least, and similar enough that you'd pick up on where it came from, but different enough to say, okay, this is a little different. And, you know, what does this difference mean? But with that, if they knew that they were taking an earlier story and repurposing it, it's like, it implies that they knew that this wasn't real. So who is the Jesus that they have in mind if they know that, you know, the list of stories that we have in the Gospels are mostly, if not completely, copied from other sources? Who is this Jesus person that they're trying to convince people you really need to believe in him? Well, these stories you made up. So who is it that you're talking about believing in? Do you know what I mean? Does that question make sense?
It feels like there's a couple of things wrapped up in there. So there is, what is their motivation for writing the stories if they don't believe it's historical, and who do they think actually Jesus was?
Yeah. So who are they trying to convince you he is? Yeah.
Yeah. So for example, like the Gospel of Mark seems to like go out of its way in a couple of places to say, by the way, this is parable. You better be interpreting as parable. And the reason you don't understand it is I haven't explained it to you yet. You need to get smart enough in this group before we explain everything to you. And that does seem to be something that the Christians were doing, that they would have an outward story that was basically treated as historical truth. But once you came in, you would understand, here's what we're actually trying to explain with these stories. If Matthew is trying to write in that same sort of way, that he is trying to go out of his way to make something that is not historically plausible. And when you analyze it, you realize sometimes he literally is going out of his way to be implausible. For example, he takes the story of Mark at the death of Jesus and the temple veil being ripped and darkness for 3 hours at noontime and things like that. Matthew's like, I can do better. Not only do those things happen, but there's a giant earth-splitting earthquake, and it brings out a horde of effectively zombies. Yeah. And it's like, it's not because he had a source, except that if you actually look at the Greek and you realize, oh, he's actually riffing off this resurrection scene from Ezekiel, which talks about earthquakes and then bodies rising from the grave to prove that God is almighty. And you realize that's the message he's trying to get across. And if you take that as literal, you probably missed the point. So I'm reasonably convinced at this point that Matthew was not trying to write history. He didn't think he was writing history. How much did he believe that Jesus did the various things that happened in the gospel? I honestly don't really know at this point. Not from my Star of Bethlehem research, because saying that the birth story didn't happen doesn't prove the historicity of Jesus one way or the other. We can make up stories about historical people all the time. There's actually some similar stories about the birth of Alexander the Great, but we're darn sure Alexander lived. But like the arguments from like Richard Carey in particular are convincing to me that there probably wasn't an historical figure at the root of everything. But even by the time of Matthew, did he think there was at least a historical figure at the time and now he's just growing out a story? I honestly don't know. I feel very uncertain to make any sort of claims about what Matthew believed about an historical figure. But ultimately, what he's trying to present is the theological message of Jesus was the Messiah, and his death and resurrection are what are needed to understand salvation and the coming kingdom of God. And also needed to promote a Jesus that basically said, by the way, all that kosher law, you better still be following it, because God didn't forget those laws. And if you do, God's going to forget you. Slap.
You mentioned the idea that, the parables that God or the people are writing a story that everyone who's maybe, the hoi polloi are going to think this is literally what happened, but that there's like an inner circle that's going to get the mysteries, kind of getting into the mystery cult dynamics. What do you think they would have said if you could be a fly on the wall in the Christian version of the Mithraeus, temple, when they're in their little dark, quiet room with their candles glowing and saying, you all are in an inner circle. We know you've read the same stories, but you've gone through your initiation. You're one of us. We're going to tell you what this is really about. What kind of things do you think could have happened? I know this is all conjecture, but what do you think those kind of conversations would have been like?
Because I think ultimately what the Christians were relying on in the earliest days was revelation and scriptural deductions. You are going to probably see things that are much more like the visionary experiences that you see. So for example, Paul describes his own vision going up into the third heaven. Revelation is all about visions and getting direct communications from Jesus and about the coming end of the world and descent of the temple of heaven coming down to earth, and things like that. It might have been things like that being explained and saying, here's the purpose of these stories and here is the coming thing. And maybe the higher ups are also being promoted to have their own visionary experiences. Paul's talking about, people in church services going and, speaking in tongues and prophesying and things like that. It seems like that's the sort of activity in at least early Christianity of basically everyone is trying to get their brain in a state to connect with the Almighty and prepare for the coming kingdom. And then, of course, try to convince as many other people to join the party before anyone who's not part of the group gets the worst of things.
Yeah.
How that continues to be by the time that Gospels are written is much less clear to me. There were clearly some people who were adamant that the stories must have happened, like in the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, who was supposed to have been a martyr. He's pretty adamant in there that these stories happened and are essential, that if these things didn't happen, then his own suffering is in vain. So there is perhaps a couple of factors that might have led people to be more and more literalistic in the stories of Jesus, that one, that already to the masses, they're trying to promote these stories is true. And after the earliest groups of Christians have died off, that tradition may have been lost, leaving you with just the people who believe what you read is the real deal. And then, of course, the promotion that we need this to be true, perhaps in some ways for political reasons, that the groups that are promoting this is really, really real. and your flesh and blood going to really come back is more captivating to an audience than these are nice allegories, and you'll rise in some sort of ethereal body that will exist as a twinkling light in the sky that may not just captivate people in the same sort of way, even though that does seem to be the thing that the earliest Christians were promoting.
It's interesting as you're talking, it makes me think kind of in a chuckling sense about how I can't help but wonder how possible it is that some of these things did simply evolve very quickly because of the culture that they were in. I mean, you think even about our culture with, the last administration and the whole fake news motif. You think if in the age of the internet and CNN and just instant information, if we can't get some of the basic information correct, how much easier would it have been to tell basically a fib about what happened, and to convince everyone, especially when eventually it's at the end of a sword, you will turn or burn, but to convince everybody this actually really happened. I mean, you're talking about people who, number one, I believe most of them didn't live past 30 or 40, so generationally, that you wouldn't have been able to verify stuff that happened even a generation or two ago because they're all dead for the most part. And word of mouth, obviously, that whole dynamic of, well, I saw it. I swear I saw this happen. I swear I saw the, Virgin Mary, the statue weeping, and all of a sudden, like, everyone's just like, well, I guess it happened. And with whether you're adding in really speculative things like magic mushrooms, or you're just saying people are just, going out and doing these fasts for 40 days and having visions because they're so psychologically charged, whatever kind of dynamics could have happened in that culture, I could see it having been so much easier to craft a lie and convince people. And I have a hard time when people, say there's just no way that this was made up in a lie, because we see it even in our own world where people can see the news and see information and then make up a completely different narrative about it. And if we can do it in our world, they certainly could have done it when there was not even probably a newspaper for most of the world, and there certainly was no internet or way to verify stuff. You could say, oh, I saw 500 people saw this happen. No, where are their names? Can I go talk to them? Oh, no, they died a generation or two ago. Okay, well, then I guess it happened. It's like, you can't, I could have seen the lies spreading pretty quickly. Do you agree with that, at least in part?
I definitely do. And I was just thinking of an example of that. So one of the interesting models of storytelling that was developing in the Hellenic world before the Roman Empire basically came to power was basically taking all the various myths of the gods, but making them more historical. And the key example of that was by a guy by the name of Euhemerus. And he created this story. He first creates like a story within a story, where this person goes to this magical island and there's this column on there, and unwritten is the story of how the gods really came to be. And Zeus was actually just a really important king who set up a lot of cults and things like that all around the world. And the thing is, according to that story, that Zeus died, he's buried, and his tomb is in Crete. This must have, been an absolutely crazy thing to tell people. Zeus is dead and he's buried on an island you can go and visit. The thing is, though, that tomb became real. And it was literally a place that pilgrims came to, and was one of the very popular tourist sites or pilgrimage sites in the Mediterranean world. We have records of this even like well past the time of Christianity. For example, Origen, in his arguments against Celsus, brings up the story that Zeus is dead and he's buried in Crete. So, and trying to also argue against that there's some sort of esoteric meaning behind this, even though Euhemerus probably wasn't writing history. It's kind of hard to know what he was doing, but ultimately, this is something he made up. It became real. And then there's an argument, is the story real, or is there some other sort of deeper meaning with a god that inherently you wouldn't think the Greeks would say, yeah, he dead. This is not the sort of expectation. So if Greeks and Romans can believe and not bat an eye at the idea that Zeus is dead and buried and you can go and visit, and it's all basically because one guy was making up stories, then it seems plenty plausible that other people can believe that, or even just like half believe it, that they ultimately might think, well, that's the story Is it true? Doesn't really matter. It's an interesting story. Here's the meaning of it. It's really hard to get into that mind because a lot of people just didn't really try critically thinking, okay, what actually happened versus what's a good story to tell.
Hmm. Certainly proof of concept. And it's crazy to think about that. It's a great example. I appreciate you sharing that. It's like they took something that truly was in no way real and they kind of made it real. That's just amazing to think about. And it must have been pretty interesting to be whoever started crafting or making that tomb, to think the just the power that they would have over people's lives. And you still see it even, today with these relics in these churches, like this is exactly where so-and-so did this amazing miracle. And, a church evolves around it. And it's like people flock to it because it's got so much magical power to them. Crazy.
Yeah. It's a similar thing, yeah, with all the various relics. I mean, what were there, like 8 different foreskins of Jesus that were supposed to be holy relics? And someone has to have made that up. But the ultimate reason they made it up is also so that way that their church or cathedral or place can then become an important holy site. So there's that, mixed thing, like saying we're going to make things up, but present them as real. And also, because there's some financial incentive for that as well. Yeah, people are willing to, fib a little to get a lot. And of course, they'll probably also have some sort of pious reason for this. This will make people contemplate on the humanity and youth of Jesus, that he also, went through and, subscribed to the law and, did everything under the law so that way he could save us from it. I can imagine that they would make those sorts of arguments. But then if you're the person in the back and say, is that thing real? And they'd probably be told, shut up, shut up.
Yeah. And it seems like it's worth admitting too, that there were, like as Bart Ehrman says, and I'm sure other people, there were various Christianities that were competing. And so to say, well, it evolved potentially from, pure mythology into, euhemerizing it to whatever else. Like there were a lot of different people arguing about what this was, what it meant, how it started, what books were in, what books were out. And they thought about the books being in or out for hundreds of years. And it's like, we're debating it and contemplating it now as like the version that's been passed down to us, but it's been so, edited and redacted and filtered and sliced and diced. By the time we get to it, we're just looking at the version that we ended up with. But, if the dice had fallen a little differently, it could have been a very different version of the gospels that we're reading. Maybe we'd be debating the infancy gospels where we're talking about Jesus, killing his friends and the neighbors as a kid, or whatever, or making doves appear, bringing them to life. And it's like, it's just fascinating to me how this whole thing, we, even as an atheist, like I have to remind myself, there's a lot more books, there are a lot more mindsets that were going on. And then you bring in even the bigger picture, like it isn't just within Christianity. There was so much syncretism and these other aspects of the Greek, Roman, Jewish world that you just, if you really want to understand this stuff, like I have to open my mind wide up and read these other books. And I've been fascinated personally with Enoch. I'm sure you've dove into that from your studies, but Enoch is just blowing my mind with. I'm reading that over and over and looking for the parallels and the quotes that it brings in the New Testament. And there's so many influences here that it reminds me of, like, do you use Photoshop at all?
I have in the past, but it's something I haven't worked with much.
Well, like the concept of layers, where you could have a picture, like say you took a picture of your, your dog on the grass, and it's just your dog on the grass and that's it. Well, you feel like it's kind of boring. So you find a way to put a beautiful tree behind the dog, 100 feet back. And then you go into another layer, you add sunshine, fake sunshine rays. And then you add this and you add that. And eventually you've got this. You remember back in the day when to make that, like in the classroom, you would have this projector and you'd have a flat piece of clear plastic with a drawing, and you put one piece down, then you put another. And when it did the reflection on the screen, you'd see it would kind of blend them. And it's kind of the same thing. And it's almost like somebody's going back and bringing in Old Testament stuff, and someone's bringing in stuff from the Maccabean era. Someone's bringing in Enochian stuff. Someone's potentially bringing in Pythagoreanism, Homeric epics. And it's like, you have to just kind of become a jack of all trades with this stuff, because you can't ignore it. You can't say, well, this is just Old Testament mimesis, because now you're ignoring the Homeric epics. You can't say it's just astrotheology, because it's a lot of it's not. And it's like you have to become aware of all these layers. I should say, for the sake of time, to mentioning astrotheology makes me think, could you take us back to this? I've gotten us off track a little bit, and I apologize for that. I appreciate, again, your answer to my questions, but going back to your book, what else did you dive into and discover specifically about the star as you were researching this?
So on the topic of astrology and astrotheology, and I like to try to separate the two because in antiquity, astrology was a science. And in fact, you had many people who were true scientists working on the subject and even treating it scientifically, because in the older Babylonian form, the way that ultimately the planets influence us was through sympathetic magic. You start seeing, like in some of the Greek ideas, like saying, well, they're trying to have a more mechanical understanding of how maybe the planets could be churning up the elements or things like that to have their causal forces. And they're even sometimes like collecting large amounts of data to try to figure out what sorts of correlations will actually have the causal effects that we're expecting. So while ultimately it's poor science, they were trying to be scientific. They were thinking in scientific ways of how to explore and expand upon it. But and like I said, I distinguish that from astrotheology, which I see as looking at the stars, the motions of the stars, and then trying to tell theological myths or stories in that sort of way. I've actually been going back, and in particular on astrotheology, finding that it isn't a very good explanation for a lot of the Old and New Testament, because I explore and realize just how little astronomy is even in the Bible itself. Like if you flip through the entire Old Testament and you try like making a list of all the references to the constellations and the planets, you're going to come up with a short list. It's basically 2 chapters in Job, and that's about it. And even there, it is extremely sparse. And it's just basically a quick thing saying, God saying, I control these constellations. Do you? No, shut up. That's about it. There isn't like these great myths, and like, the Greeks have all these stories about like how the bears got their long tails. What's the enmity between Scorpio and Orion? Why are the fish tied with ribbon? All these sorts of stories to explain the various star stories. You don't find any of that in the Old Testament. You mentioned Enoch as well. And it's also, I'm impressed by how little astronomy is in it for its own time. That, yes, it does have astronomy there. It says like, here's how many days there is in a year, here's the lunar cycle and things like that. But it presents like no planetary theory, even though by the time Enoch is being written, people have already been coming up with the epicycle systems to explain the motions of the planets. So like there is that astronomy in there, and yet it's unimpressive by comparison to what even existed at the time, let alone nowadays.
Yeah.
So
well, do you see like in the epic, like the big picture, like, how, I don't know if you heard this, but C.S. Lewis wrote those stories, the Chronicles of Narnia, 7 books. People have been studying for decades, and all of a sudden a scholar came out like a decade ago and said, I realized that back in ancient times they thought there were 7 planets, and the 7 books of Narnia are structured based on those 7 planets, and there's themes that we've into that. And like Bill Darlison, are you familiar with Bill Darlison?
I think I watched your interview with him.
The Zodiac and the Gospels. He talks about how the Gospel of Mark is structured, and it's not like they're trying to use it to explain, argue for a lunar Sabbath versus a solar Sabbath, but they're just using these structures in a very broad sense and saying, do you see the precession of the equinox, or whatever, you see the constellations, do you see that we're going to do the same thing? Do you think that's there?
Unfortunately, no. I find that case, I don't know so well with C.S. Lewis. I'd have to look into that to see if he would be using that or not. I don't honestly know. But with Mark, I don't see that there for a couple of reasons. One, the precession of the equinoxes, it's unclear how much that was even common knowledge for regular folks. And secondly, it's not something you can even actually observe. So just, for completeness, what the equinoxes are is, we usually say that that's like when there's equal amounts of day and night. The more technical thing is if you have the path of the sun called the ecliptic, and then you have the celestial equator, which is taking Earth's equator, projecting out into space. When the sun is at that intersection, that is the equinox. And then there's 2 equinoxes, the vernal and autumnal, the spring and fall equinoxes. So you might think, okay, I'm going to go out and look at the sun and see where it is on the equinox. There's a problem with that. You're looking at the sun. You're going to blind yourself in that process. And you'll think, okay, well, I'll just wait for the sun to set and then look at the stars. Well, the sun is set. Now you can't see where it is. You can't actually see the vernal equinox. It actually has to be calculated out. And there's a reason that it was said to have been discovered by Hipparchus. And the way he discovered it was actually somewhat recently related. So just a couple of nights ago, we had a really good lunar eclipse. Hipparchus used lunar eclipses and then measured the distance between the lunar eclipse where when the moon is like fully red, because that's when it's perfectly opposite the sun. So he knows the exact angle between the moon and sun. He then measures that between the moon and the star Spica, and then uses that angle to figure out where the sun is, and then looks at old observations and say, hey, it shifted about 1 degree over a century. So this requires looking at centuries of data, careful observations, not of the sun, but of the moon, to then back calculate, to then figure out the sun actually has changed its position for that equinox time. So this is not something that you can just actively observe. If someone says they've done that, they must have amazing eyes that can somehow shield them from the brightness of the sun and still see the background stars. So just from an observational point of view, that doesn't make sense. Also, if it's supposed to really be that Jesus is talking about the coming of the age of Pisces and the end of the age of Aries, the disciples shouldn't have been all that excited. We, from the horoscopes of the astrologers, we know where they placed the vernal equinox, and it was at the time of Jesus at about 5 degrees Aries. What does that mean? It means the equinox would have to move 5 degrees to enter Pisces. How long would that have taken? According to the Greeks, based on their own measurements, it's about 1 century to move 1 degree. So the end of the world, the coming new age, is in 500 years. Who calls that I'm coming soon?
Yeah.
So I find that unconvincing because of the observational difficulties and what we know about where the equinox was at that time, according to the various astrological texts that we've dug up.
Do you think they were using at least maybe some constellation motifs?
The best place that I've seen people try to make that argument isn't in the Gospels, but in Revelation.
Okay.
In particular, there's a few places where people will point to. So there's the vision of the throne with the cherubim with 4 faces, a man, an ox, a lion, and an eagle, which already is obviously really strange vision. The thing is, though, that's taken from Ezekiel when he describes the throne. And there have been a number of really good scholars that have tried to argue that these 4 faces of the cherubim are supposed to represent 4 zodiacal constellations, and then like basically represent like the equinoxes and solstices or something to that effect. But when you dig into the details, you find out, well, the man is actually Scorpio. That doesn't make too much sense. And the eagle is Pegasus. Wait, that's a horse. And also not part of the zodiac. Others will say it's Aquila, not part of the zodiac. And so you have to have like all this like mishmashing to try to hammer a round peg into a square hole. And is that what Ezekiel was even trying to do? I don't think so, for one other reason. When Ezekiel was writing, this was about a century or so before the zodiac as we know it was finally invented by the Babylonians. So it's like, okay, most likely Ezekiel is not trying to use these motifs because 1, it's really hard to make anything fit. 2, and the entire horoscope or zodiac system wouldn't exist in the form that we understand it until a century and a half after his final vision.
Interesting.
And then Revelation is pulling from that. So it's like, we don't need to use astrology or astronomy to explain that. The other place people will point to astrotheology is in the vision of the woman giving birth and the red dragon, all in Revelation 12. And at first that might make a lot of sense because like, oh, the woman is Virgo the Virgin, the dragon is Draco or Hydra. They'll argue about that. And then say, oh, this is like the dragon chasing the woman in the sky or something to that effect. Depends on who you're reading, who's going to argue that. But again, you get down to the details and you say, wait a minute. This doesn't quite make sense. First off, it just says she's a woman. Virgo, the virgin, there's nothing in the text that says this woman is a virgin. That's an importation of the virgin birth into the story. Secondly, she's supposed to be wearing a crown. There's no depiction, there's no like written depiction of Virgo, the constellation or the zodiacal sign, as wearing a crown. Again, that is forced into it. And of course, also the woman and the dragon both are supposed to come down to Earth. Guess what constellations don't do?
Yeah.
If they did, that already would have been the end of the world.
Yeah.
So I find these arguments often not very convincing once you get down into the nitty gritty details. But conversely, you got to, say, well, Aaron, what's your explanation? If you're so smart, what's going on there? So I'm going to reveal a little bit on a project I'm trying to work on.
Please.
Because it still relates to my Star of Bethlehem stuff. So I've been curious if the Star of Bethlehem story of Matthew has a precedent, like some older version that Matthew is then rewriting. And in particular, there's all these statements that Jesus is a particular kind of astronomical body, not the sun, but he is in 3 different places called the morning star. In Ignatius's letter to the Ephesians, he says he's a bright star, and these sorts of things. So it's like, what's going on there? And then there's also this star at his birth. And there's actually like one later gospel, the Revelation of the Magi is called, where Jesus is the star coming to his own birth, which, how do you square that circle? That's a little bit weird. But it's like, okay, is there some common connection here? And in particular, I'm speculating, trying to prove something, but it's still a bit speculative. It has not gone through the rigorous peer review process where somebody says, no, and you're wrong 5 ways to Sunday. At this point, what I'm thinking is the vision as described is coming from the Old Testament, derivations, especially of Psalm 110, where it talks of the king who is born of dawn, like dawn is some sort of goddess. And there is in Second Enoch, dawn rising wearing a crown. So like there's already that imagery of dawn being kind of like a goddess figure wearing royal figurines and then giving birth to Jesus. Well, this sounds kind of like what it says in Psalm 110, at least in some translations, where it says basically the king is born of the dawn goddess. Well, in Revelation, this is a woman clothed with the sun, giving birth of someone who will then reign with power. And then there's this quote of Psalm 2. Psalm 2 and 110 usually go together very often. They're usually like even quoted together. They're both coronation psalms. They're both about the birth of the king, which is basically his coronation. And that's when he becomes God's son. And so I'm thinking maybe something like this is behind all of these stories, which also would imply the original Star of Bethlehem story was pure astral myth, not astral theology, because it's ultimately deriving from Old Testament, not star stories, but it's being placed in the heavens, and then Matthew is bringing it down to earth. That is something I'm currently working to argue out and show it's plausible and more plausible than some of the other suggestions that have been put forward. Otherwise, the vision of Jesus and the dragon and all that has been enigmatic. People have pointed to other precedents that I don't think quite work, but that's an argument I need to make professionally before I declare I am the greatest thing since scholarly sliced bread.
Yeah, well, if you ever get that book written, I will definitely read that. That sounds fascinating. I'm fascinated by the whole realm. I would say I'm at a point where I think, not in any way to disagree with you, but I've seen too much to not think it's probably much more related to the story. I know people knock Acharya a lot, and I think she needs to be brought back in this discussion, even from the grave, so to speak, that I think she brought a lot more than people acknowledge her for. But I need to do a lot more digging before I can get to that level. But it definitely fascinates me, and it's almost like I'm afraid to dig into it, in the sense that I think it's going to be just such a big research project. I'm neck deep in Enoch right now and Jubilees and things like that. So I'm kind of distracted anyway. But I feel like when the day comes when I can quit my day job and I'm doing YouTube full time and I'm just researching nonstop in between interviews, I'm really looking forward to the day that I can just like kind of drop everything for a while and just focus on astrotheology. Between what I've seen from Bill Darlison and John Lundwall and a few other people in Acharya, and even things from people that don't emphasize it enough, like Dr. Bob, Dr. Price, I do think that there's some interesting things there that I don't know that I would want to argue that things are astrotheological, but just to bring them to the table and say, this is a little bit too interesting to, like, it's too juicy of a tidbit to not share. I'm definitely more along the lines of just putting information on the table and saying to people, you do with it what you want, but at least understand this. There's some interesting stuff here that seems a little bit too interesting to be just pure irony. And so I'm really fascinated by it, but I'm drawn to it a lot, especially like when you look at Elijah and Elisha and the 42 bears and all that stuff, and the two bears coming out of the forest to kill
Yeah,
the 42 kids.
when it comes to places where I think there is at least good cases of, or at least much clearer cases of astrotheology, is a little bit more outside the Bible, but still in Jewish Christian literature. So, are you familiar with the sibling oracles?
I know that they exist, but I've not researched them now.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to research because they're actually like not one document by one person, but it's written by multiple authors over centuries, both Jewish and Christian, with various editings going along the way. So it's a really complicated document to deal with. But in the fifth book of the Sibling Oracles, we think it's written by someone who's Jewish, probably in the early second century. And at the end of that story, he has what various authors have called a star war, where literally all the constellations are fighting each other. And there's other pagan precedents for that as well, where there's other stories that are done like that. So this seems to me like the most clear example of something astrotheological. And I point this out because it's the clearest attempt. And even then, it's not a very good job because it doesn't show much familiarity with like the stories of the constellations, like the ones that fight each other. It feels random. There's like not an astronomical or mythological or astrological reason why these two would fight each other. Other things, it's mostly just like, for example, one of the things it says is like Scorpio will hide beneath its tail. That basically means, okay, the person knows that's supposed to be a scorpion. Scorpions have tails, and that's about all their knowledge is. They don't know anything about, oh, there were fights between Scorpio and Orion, or Orion hunts a lion, or things like that. None of those things are in there. And so it's like, if this is like the best case of clear astrotheology I can find, even then it's not sophisticated. To me, it looks like mostly Jews and Christians might put their toe in the water.
Yeah.
But for the most part, they want the water to boil away.
Yeah. It is interesting, though, you do see the some of the zodiac symbols in the synagogues in their floors.
Yes.
And that's
though that actually only starts happening in the late antique medieval periods. Like the earliest ones come from about the 4th century.
Okay.
And I was actually just looking this up. The earliest ones we have from the 4th century show signs of also, they're in synagogues, yes, but they were probably created by Gentiles. One is that they seem to get the Hebrew backwards in a few places when writing down the names. And the depictions are completely Greek, including the human figures are male or are naked, and the male ones are not circumcised. Which is not what you'd expect from someone Jewish. First off, depicting them naked, and two, with their foreskins.
Yeah.
So later they change it and make it, more in line with Jewish sensibilities. But it shows that, that's about the time it was being imported, and that they're showing that sort of symbolism for like, God is in control of the universe, and we can also use it something kind of like a calendar because the 12 months for the 12 signs, things like that can work. But as for like making a grand tale that the story of the Hebrew people is the sun going through the zodiac, that doesn't seem to really explain the evidence all that well, especially because, a lot of the stories of the Old Testament that we find in the Tanakh probably predate the invention of the zodiac. So, and just the general lack of any like great astronomical knowledge for the longest time until later in Judaism. Like later on, like in the medieval period, Jews are some of the most important astronomers and astrologers up in, basically to modern times. But in antiquity, you have to search a little bit further to find them. You can find them. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are some horoscopes, for example, though they're not quite the same as like the Greek-Roman ones that we have like dug up from Egypt and elsewhere. But we know they were thinking about these sorts of things. In the rabbinic literature, there's awareness of astrology, but there's also kind of an ambivalence towards it. One of the rabbis apparently must have studied astrology because he also applied it to medicine. Like you're supposed to do bloodletting when Mars is not in certain positions because Mars is red, blood is red, things like that. But even he said, like, don't believe that, the astrological forces can control us. There's generally ambivalence towards astrology and that. But on the other hand, you got to do astronomy if you want to have your calendar to work, because up until basically the 4th century, the Jewish calendar was completely observational. You had to look at the phases of the moon to figure out when the month began, and then figure out when the festivals will be, and also figure out if you're going to add in a leap month, because the Jewish calendar has leap months in it.
And wasn't that part of some of the arguments with the Essenes and just the groups arguing about which calendar to use for the Sabbath, and that if you weren't using the right one, you're basically, disobeying God, and it's a really big concern for some of the groups at that time. Yeah.
Yeah, so they definitely had that sort of astronomical knowledge. It was necessary for that. And also like caring about maybe what certain signs are rising, because that'll probably tell you the seasons, because hey, you got to know when to harvest and when to plant and things like that. Like we find in Hesiod's Works and Days, which is basically kind of an instruction manual. When you see the Pleiades rise, this is what you should be doing in your farmland. The Jews almost certainly had that level of knowledge, because it was almost been impossible to not notice the sky. But on the other hand, there's like no planetary theory. There's like no advanced theory of the moon. There's no eclipse predictions, even though the Greeks and Romans were already able to do that with astonishing accuracy. In particular, I remember St. Augustine, before he became a Christian, he was a Manichaean, which had a strong astrological, astrotheological component to it. So when the moon eclipses the sun, that is literally a war in heaven. That is the sun and moon fighting. But then a Roman astronomer basically, is telling him, hey, we can predict these years in advance. And Augustine is like, wait. These are supposed to be entities with free will. How can you predict what they're going to do years in advance? And then finds out, no, he did correctly predict this eclipse. And this was one of his reasons for abandoning Manichaeism and then joining up with the Christian groups in the end, in part because of his beliefs about free will. So, it shows how complicated the world was. There definitely was astronomy and astrology, astrotheology. These were things that were important to those fabrics of things. But in terms of like being a grand explanation for like the entire Bible, it doesn't seem to be very parsimonious, and very often it requires a lot of hammering in or choosing bits of evidence. I'll give also a recommendation for an example of where I see things. So I have this book here by Bruce Molina called On the Genre of the Message of Revelation. It's basically a giant attempt to explain everything in Revelation in terms of basically astrotheology. Some of the arguments, I've already kind of discussed about like this sign is that, and other things, he literally tries to explain everything with astrology, including the number 666. He tries connecting that to a constellation called Triangulus the Triangle. And ultimately, when I go through and look through this, it is ultimately I find to be a really poor case, especially because he tries to find evidence like saying, well, the reason that dragon in Revelation is red is because red is the color of south, and that's where the dragon is. Why is red the color of the south? Because of this artifact in China. Wait. We're going all the way to China and just hoping there's some sort of connection that made it all the way over here that now makes it so every time someone sees red, they think south. That is just so thin a read to base an entire theory on. And I just find that over and over in that book. Now, I'm not going to recommend people buy it because right now it's out of print. If you go on Amazon, it's like $800. It's absurd. So find it in a library, or there's a more up-to-date version as well by Molina as well called a sociological commentary on the book of Revelation. That one you can at least get on Kindle without having to pay an arm, a leg, your first and second born, and a goat sacrifice.
Exactly. Well,
I fortunately got this one cheap.
Yeah. Well, I know we're out of time from our scheduled time, but I did just want to say, just talking about these topics really whets my appetite to hopefully find time soon to dig into these and get a lot more educated on it. I love thinking about it, and for whether the influence was on the Bible of astrotheology was 1% or 5% or whatever it was. It was certainly a piece of it at some levels, and it is interesting to at least dive into it and still leave room for the other large motifs that we know were there, like the Old Testament mimesis and the Midrash and all that. But I appreciate you bringing some of these insights and directions. I'll definitely be doing some digging, and I hope we can touch base again. I'd love to dig in with you later, maybe in next year, to after I've hopefully grounded myself more in some of these topics and read your book from front to back, and especially if you do that other book, definitely want to dig into that. But I'd love to touch base with you again and kind of dig into some of these with maybe some more refined questions about astronomy. And it's, even if it's not astrotheology, it's fascinating to really ground ourselves in ancient cosmology to understand, even if we're just trying to talk about like the levels of heaven you mentioned with Paul with the third heaven, what were the Enochian Christians seeing above them? What did they expect to happen? All these things, and even just going through these levels of heaven and knowing the magic words to get through the door without being slaughtered. All these fascinating things that, like, if you really want to understand Christian origins, you kind of have to almost like put yourself, like when I was a Christian, the phrase was always learn the context. There's a reason that Paul said this. It's in the bigger context of the chapter, of his book, of all of his books, of the Bible. What's the context of this particular sentence in this verse? And it's like you have to take that concept and broaden it to this and say, these people who wrote these books, whoever they were, they had a bigger context. Some of it was astrotheological. Certainly there was cosmology involved. There was a lot of Homeric stuff. There was a lot of mystery cult stuff. There was a lot of ancient Jewish stories, as well as mythologies. All these other books that we don't talk about, but in Second Temple Judaism, that meant the world to these people. But to really put yourself in their shoes and say, what were they like? What was their, when they went to the synagogues, and when the philosophers were in Alexandria were reading stuff and debating, what were they talking about? What was in their hearts and minds? And to try to figure that out, and it definitely moves some of these conversations forward. And I love that you're bringing these topics to the table. So thank you for that. It means a lot.
I'm glad to. And for future conversations, one thing I could also recommend is how science has affected the stories that we have told, because with Greek science and how that not only changed cosmology, but just the way people were understanding the world and how they talked about it. And then, of course, our modern versions, where we basically have now found a way to really push away superstition to come to this world that runs on deterministic laws of nature. That transition to what we had before has so dramatically changed the sorts of people that we are, is worthy of discussion and exploration in itself.
Yeah, it's like not even going to the stories, but analyzing how we are changing as the interpreters. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, how we can look at the exact same thing and we go from fear to awe of the exact same object, because we go from superstition to mathematization.
Awesome. Yeah, I'd love to. Absolutely. Well, let's do it. I appreciate your time today. I know we're out of time here, but we've been speaking with Dr. Aaron Adair. I appreciate your work. I'm going to plug your book one last time, The Star of Bethlehem, A Skeptical View. Sorry again for the gloss, but please go pick it up. I'll have some links as well if you want to connect with Aaron separately. But I appreciate your story. Thank you for sharing sort of your personal story there at the beginning, and as well as your insights on astronomy. And was there anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up?
It has been an absolute pleasure coming on. And if everyone's still awake, I hopefully will see you again.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it again. And do you want to end with Captain Picard's, final words after they plotted the course?
Okay. Mr. Data, warp factor 9, engage.
Awesome. Make it so. Thank you, Dr. Adair. Really appreciate your time today. Let's do it again.
Take care.